It began in darkness so complete it felt deliberate. The hills around Mortain were wrapped in thick night air, heavy with moisture, the kind that dampened sound and blurred distance until the world shrank to whatever stood just a few steps ahead. Fog clung to the valleys like a living thing, sliding slowly between trees, settling into folds of land that had already been torn apart by weeks of fighting. The countryside looked peaceful from above, green slopes, narrow roads, quiet villages, but beneath that calm surface, something desperate was gathering strength. Mortain sat at the edge of a moment, slipping away. By early August of 1944, the German army in Normandy was bleeding ground at an alarming pace. The American breakout from the hedgerows had shattered the careful balance of defence. Armoured columns surged forward, roads once clogged with resistance now opened into long corridors of movement. To German commanders watching the map, it felt as if the front itself was unravelling thread by thread, and so they reached for one last, violent solution. Operation Lüttich was born from urgency, not confidence. A counterattack meant to cut through American lines, to strike westward toward Avranches, to sever the lifeline, pouring men, fuel, and momentum into France. If it succeeded, the Allied breakout could be strangled. If it failed, the war in the West would tilt beyond recovery. Mortain stood directly in the path of that gamble. German armoured units assembled under cover of night, engines muffled, columns inching forward along narrow roads that wound through forest and hillside. Panthers and tigers rolled past hedgerows, still wet with dew. Infantry followed close behind, boots crunching softly on gravel. Orders were whispered. Cigarettes were crushed out quickly. There was no room for hesitation. Speed was the only hope. Just before dawn, the attack began. Artillery cracked the silence with sudden violence. Shells slammed into American positions scattered across the hills, ripping apart trees and earth. The fog glowed briefly with each explosion, then closed in again. German armour surged forward, appearing out of the mist with terrifying suddenness. Tanks loomed like moving shadows, guns already trained, engines roaring now with nothing left to hide. For the Americans caught in the first wave, the shock was overwhelming. Units were thinly spread, visibility was nearly non-existent, communication broke down instantly. Small groups fought isolated battles without knowing what lay beyond the next ridge. And yet, on the heights overlooking Mortain, something unexpected happened. American infantry dug in on the high ground, particularly around Hill 314, refusing to yield, even as German forces flowed around them. Cut off, surrounded, outnumbered, these men held their positions under relentless pressure. German tanks fired point-blank into defensive lines. Mortars rained down, machine gun fire swept the slopes. The fog, once an ally of the attackers, now trapped them in confusion, masking American positions they could not fully locate. Inside those defensive pockets, time lost its meaning. Minutes felt like hours. Hours blurred into a single grinding test of endurance. Water ran low. Ammunition thinned. Wounded men were dragged into shallow cover, scraped out of rocky soil. Every sound carried weight, every engine noise, every shouted command, every explosion echoing through the mist. Above the fog, the sky waited. As morning wore on, the weather shifted. The fog began to lift, slowly, unevenly, like a curtain rising at the worst possible moment. And with it came the sound the German forces had feared most, the distant, rising howl of Allied aircraft engines. Once the sky cleared, the battlefield transformed. American fighter bombers descended in waves, their silhouettes sharp against the brightening blue. Rockets slammed into armoured columns packed tightly on narrow roads. Bombs tore through convoys stalled by wreckage and confusion. Tanks burned where they stood, smoke spiralling upward like signals of defeat. Roads became death traps. Retreating units collided with advancing ones. The counterattack lost cohesion in real time. On the ground, the defenders sensed the shift. Pressure eased in some places. German assaults slowed, then faltered. Orders became frantic. Momentum vanished. The Battle of Mortain was no longer an offensive. It was a collapse unfolding under open sky. German units attempted to regroup, to push forward one last time, but the opportunity had passed. Fuel shortages worsened, command structures fractured. American forces counterattacked from multiple directions, tightening the grip around what remained of the assault force. The hills that had sheltered attackers now exposed them. By the time the fighting subsided, the ground around Mortain was littered with wreckage, twisted armour, shattered vehicles, abandoned equipment. The countryside bore fresh scars, etched into hillsides that had once looked timeless. Smoke drifted lazily over fields where the grass had been pressed flat by men and machines locked in violent struggle. Mortain marked the end of hope for a German recovery in Normandy. From its failure flowed the encirclement at Falaise. From its collapse came the race across France. From its outcome came the realization that the war in the West had crossed a point of no return. Tonight, we return to those fog-covered hills, to the sudden roar of engines in the dark, to the defenders holding high ground against impossible odds, to the moment when weather, terrain, and timing reshaped the fate of entire armies, to the battle where desperation met reality and reality did not bend. Before we continue deeper into this story, I want to ask you something gentle and personal. Where in the world are you listening from right now, and what hour has quietly arrived there? Is the night settled and still around you, or does the day linger just beyond your window? And something deeper, unique to this episode, the Battle of Mortain reminds us how quickly momentum can change, how a single moment can decide whether something continues or collapses. In your own life, has there been a moment when everything seemed balanced on a narrow edge, when one outcome changed everything? If you feel comfortable, share what that moment taught you, and if these long, steady journeys into the past help your breathing slow, your thoughts settle, or your mind drift toward rest, consider subscribing. The map room at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force fell silent on the evening of August 3rd, 1944. General Omar Bradley stood motionless, his finger tracing a thin red line on the battle map that stretched from Saint-Lô through Avranches and into the open country beyond. In 72 hours, more than 100,000 American troops had poured through a gap barely 6 miles wide, punching through German defences that had held since D-Day. The bocage country of Normandy, those killer hedgerows that had consumed men and machines for 2 months, suddenly lay behind them. Brittany beckoned to the west, Paris to the east, and the road to Germany stretched ahead like an open highway. Bradley should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt uneasy. The breakout had been spectacular, almost too spectacular. Operation Cobra, launched on July 25th with a carpet bombing that turned 3 square miles of French countryside into a lunar landscape, had shattered the German 7th Army's western flank. Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army, finally unleashed after weeks of frustration, had exploded through the gap at Avranches like water through a broken dam. American armour was racing west and south, capturing towns faster than mapmakers could mark them. The German army in Normandy, bled white by 2 months of attritional warfare, seemed to be collapsing. Intelligence reports spoke of German units retreating in disorder, of commanders losing contact with their formations, of an army on the verge of dissolution. It looked like victory. It smelled like victory. But something about the intelligence intercepts trickling in from Ultra, the top-secret code-breaking operation, suggested a different story was about to unfold. At Rastenburg, deep in the East Prussian forests, 1,400 miles away, Adolf Hitler studied the same situation and saw something entirely different. Where Allied commanders saw breakthrough and exploitation, Hitler saw opportunity. Where they saw German weakness, he saw a fatal Allied overextension. The map on his table showed American forces strung out in a thin, vulnerable column, all of them dependent on a single supply route through Avranches. Cut that artery, Hitler reasoned, and the entire American breakout would wither and die. Patton's Third Army would be isolated, surrounded, and destroyed. The Allies would be thrown back to the beaches, their invasion defeated, their coalition shattered. It was not merely possible, Hitler insisted to his increasingly skeptical staff. It was inevitable. He reached for his red pencil and drew a thick arrow pointing west from Mortain toward Avranches. The arrow was labelled simply Angriff, attack. Hitler's Directive Number 40, transmitted to Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge on August 2nd, was unambiguous in its delusion. The enemy breakthrough at Avranches must be cut off and destroyed. All available panzer forces would concentrate for an armoured thrust directly west to the sea. The attack would sever American supply lines, isolate Patton's forces, and restore the front. Von Kluge, a capable officer who had survived the Eastern Front, read the directive with mounting horror. His forces in Normandy had been bled down to skeletal formations. Since D-Day, the Wehrmacht had suffered 117,000 casualties in Normandy. 2,200 armoured vehicles had been destroyed or abandoned. Entire divisions existed only as names on organisational charts. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of German military might, was effectively absent from French skies. its squadrons withdrawn to defend the Reich itself. Von Kluge had perhaps 700 operational tanks remaining in all of Normandy, facing an Allied force that fielded more than 5,000. But Hitler's order was not a suggestion, and von Kluge had witnessed what happened to generals who questioned the Führer's strategic genius. So he began assembling what forces he could, scraping together panzer divisions that had been shattered and rebuilt 3 times over. The 2nd Panzer Division, the 116th Panzer Division, the 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandart Adolf Hitler, and the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich received orders to disengage from their current positions and concentrate near Mortain, a small market town in Normandy that most Germans had never heard of. They would form the spearhead of Operation Lüttich, named after the Belgian town where German forces had won a stunning victory in the opening weeks of the First World War. The historical parallel was intentional, designed to evoke past glories. But 1914 was 30 years and a lifetime ago, and the world had changed in ways Hitler refused to acknowledge. The intelligence picture emerging at Allied headquarters told a story Hitler's map room could not see. British and American codebreakers at Bletchley Park had penetrated the German Enigma cipher system so thoroughly that Allied commanders often knew German plans before the field commanders received their orders. Ultra-intercepts during the first days of August revealed unmistakable signs of a major German offensive building near Mortain. German panzer divisions were moving east, not west, in retreat, as logic would suggest. Fuel and ammunition convoys were being redirected. Artillery was being registered on new coordinates. The Germans were not running away. They were preparing to attack. Bradley and his staff studied the intercepts with fascination and growing excitement. If the Germans were concentrating for an attack, they were also concentrating for destruction. Every panzer division committed to Mortain was a panzer division that could not retreat to defend the Reich. Every day Hitler kept his forces. Attacking west was another day. Patton could swing north. The trap that Hitler thought he was setting might become the trap that destroyed his army. On August 5th, reconnaissance aircraft photographing German positions near Mortain captured images that confirmed what Ultra suggested. Long columns of tanks and vehicles were visible in woodland assembly areas, their camouflage nets hastily arranged, their positions betrayed by the telltale track marks in summer fields. Photo interpreters counted at least 200 armoured vehicles, possibly more, hidden beneath tree cover. The build-up was massive by current German standards, even if it paled compared to the forces Hitler imagined he was deploying. Bradley faced a decision that would define the campaign. He could reinforce the threatened sector, pull back from Avranches, consolidate his lines, or he could do something more audacious. He could leave the door open, let the Germans attack, and prepare to slam it shut behind them. It was a calculated risk, the kind of decision that makes or breaks military reputations. The American 30th Infantry Division, exhausted from weeks of combat, received orders on August 5th to move into the Mortain sector. The men were told they were rotating into a quiet area for rest and refitting. Mortain itself was a pleasant enough town, its medieval churches and narrow streets largely untouched by the war that had devastated so much of Normandy. Soldiers dug foxholes in the rocky Norman soil, established outposts in the surrounding hills, and settled in for what they hoped would be a few days of relative peace. Company commanders conducted hasty reconnaissance, noting that their division was responsible for defending a frontage of more than 20 miles, far beyond doctrinal recommendations. Battalion staff officers studied their maps and noted with concern that they were positioned at the base of a funnel with high ground on 3 sides. If an attack came from the east, they would be fighting uphill against enemies who held the observation advantage. On Hill 314, east of Mortain town, soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment, established positions that commanded a magnificent view. From the summit, an observer could see for 20 miles in clear weather, watching roads and valleys stretch away toward the German lines. Forward observers from the artillery set up their equipment, plotting coordinates, preparing to call fire on any enemy movement. The hill's military designation came from its elevation, 314 meters above sea level. To the Americans digging in on its slopes, it was just another position, another nameless piece of terrain, in a war full of nameless terrain. They could not know that in 72 hours, Hill 314 would become the most important piece of ground in France. They could not know that their names would be attached to that hill forever. They could not know that their stand there would help change the course of the entire war. As darkness fell on August 5th, 1944, two armies prepared for battle, in ignorance of what the other truly represented. The Germans believed they were launching a war-winning counteroffensive with overwhelming force. The Americans believed they were holding a quiet sector with adequate strength. Hitler believed he had assembled 9 panzer divisions for the attack. Von Kluge knew he had scraped together perhaps 4 understrength divisions with 210 operational tanks. Bradley believed the Germans were walking into a trap. The Germans believed they were springing one. In the space between these competing delusions, men on both sides cleaned their weapons, wrote letters home, and tried to sleep. Some of them would never wake again. Others would wake to find themselves thrust into a battle that would prove that, in war, the deadliest enemy is not the one across the line. It is the one who cannot see the line at all. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge stood in his command post on the evening of August 4, 1944, holding a directive that he knew would kill thousands of his men. The order from Hitler's headquarters at Rastenburg outlined Operation Lüttich in terms that bore no relationship to the reality von Kluge faced every day on the battlefield. 9 panzer divisions would concentrate for the attack. They would advance 30 miles to Avranches in a single thrust. They would cut the American supply line and roll up the entire Allied position from the south. The Luftwaffe would provide air cover. Follow-on forces would exploit the breakthrough and drive the Allies back to the sea. It was a plan worthy of 1940, when German panzer divisions had shattered French armies and raced to the Channel coast in a campaign that lasted 6 weeks. But this was 1944, and the German army that had conquered France no longer existed. Von Kluge knew the truth that Hitler refused to hear. The 9 panzer divisions that existed on organizational charts and in the Führer's imagination had been ground to fragments in the 2 months since D-Day. The 2nd Panzer Division, which should have fielded 200 tanks, could muster 55 operational vehicles. The 116th Panzer Division had 40 tanks running, with spare parts nearly exhausted. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, the elite formation that bore Hitler's name, could assemble 70 tanks for the offensive. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, had 45. Von Kluge's staff had compiled the numbers brutally: 210 operational tanks for an offensive that Hitler believed would involve 1,000. The arithmetic of destruction was simple and final. They would attack because Hitler had ordered it, but they would attack with 1/5 the force required for success. The absence of air support transformed the plan from difficult to suicidal. The Luftwaffe, which had once darkened European skies with thousands of aircraft, had been bled white over the Reich and had withdrawn its remaining squadrons from France entirely. German ground forces in Normandy had learned to move only at night, to hide vehicles under trees during daylight, to never gather more than a few vehicles in one place. The Allies owned the sky so completely that German soldiers could hear American fighters circling overhead like vultures, waiting for anything that moved. Von Kluge had requested air cover for the offensive. The Luftwaffe liaison officer had simply shaken his head. There were no fighters available. There were no bombers available. There was nothing available. The ground forces would attack without air support, in daylight, across open country, against an enemy who could call down aircraft within minutes. It was, von Kluge thought bitterly, like asking infantry to charge machine gun nests armed only with bayonets. SS General Sepp Dietrich, commander of the 1st SS Panzer Corps, received his orders with the stoic fatalism of a soldier who had survived 4 years on the Eastern Front. Dietrich was a street brawler who had risen from chauffeur to corps commander through loyalty to Hitler and raw courage in battle. He was not a military genius, but he understood tank warfare and he understood what was being asked of him. His corps would form the main attack force, driving due west from Mortain toward Avranches. He looked at his divisional strength returns and saw formations that existed mostly in memory. The Leibstandarte had been rebuilt 3 times since 1941, reformed after catastrophic losses in Russia, refitted after savage fighting in Italy, and now committed to an offensive in France with less than half its authorized strength. The men were exhausted, the tanks were wearing out, the fuel stocks were critically low. Dietrich lit a cigarette and began drafting his operations order, translating Hitler's fantasy into something that might possibly keep some of his men alive for another day. The planning sessions that followed revealed the gulf between Hitler's vision and battlefield reality in stark detail. Hitler's directive specified that the attack would jump off at dawn with overwhelming artillery preparation, that panzer formations would advance in mass along multiple axes, that the breakthrough would be exploited to a depth of 30 miles within 24 hours. Von Kluge's staff translated this into language that matched available resources. The attack would begin in darkness to gain a few hours of surprise before Allied aircraft appeared. Artillery preparation would be minimal to preserve ammunition stocks. The panzers would advance on a narrow front because there were not enough tanks to attack on a wide front. The objective would be to reach as far west as possible before the inevitable counterattack came. No one in the planning rooms believed they would reach Avranches. The best they could hope for was to disrupt the American supply lines temporarily, to buy time for German forces elsewhere, to establish a defensive line, to postpone the inevitable. The fuel situation alone guaranteed that Operation Lüttich would be a short-range affair. German logistics in Normandy had collapsed under the weight of Allied air interdiction. Every bridge across the Seine River had been destroyed. Every major rail yard was a bomb crater. Fuel trucks moved only at night, took circuitous routes to avoid known Allied positions, and still arrived at the front with half their cargo lost to air attacks or mechanical breakdown. The panzer divisions assembling for Lüttich had enough fuel for perhaps 50 miles of tactical movement, enough for one thrust to Avranches if everything went perfectly. If they encountered heavy resistance, if they had to maneuver extensively, if they had to fight a prolonged battle, they would run dry, and there was no prospect of resupply. The mobile warfare that had made German panzer divisions legendary in 1940 required fuel reserves that simply did not exist in France in 1944. Officers briefing their men for the attack struggled to maintain the fiction of confidence. Tank commanders gathered their crews in the evening hours of August 5th, pointing to maps, outlining routes, describing objectives they did not believe they could reach. A lieutenant in the 2nd Panzer Division, a veteran of 3 years on the Eastern Front, looked at the faces of his tank crew and saw boys trying to be men. His loader was 19. His driver was 18. His gunner, the oldest at 23, had been a university student before conscription. They had been through 6 weeks of combat in Normandy already, had lost friends to American artillery and Allied aircraft, had learned that the invincible German army of propaganda films was a ghost that haunted a war it could not win. The lieutenant told them they would reach Avranches, that they would cut the American supply line, that victory was certain. He did not tell them that he had written a final letter to his parents that evening, a letter he left with the chaplain to be mailed if he did not return. The hours before each hour took on the surreal quality of men preparing for death while pretending they were preparing for victory. Tank crews performed final maintenance checks, knowing that a breakdown during the attack meant abandonment and capture. Infantry loaded extra ammunition, aware that resupply would be impossible once battle was joined. Commanders synchronized watches, reviewed radio frequencies, established recognition signals. Everything was done with professional competence, the muscle memory of an army that had practiced these rituals for 5 years. But beneath the routine, every veteran knew they were about to attack with inadequate strength, without air support, against an enemy that grew stronger every day. They would attack because Hitler had ordered it, because refusing orders meant execution, because they were soldiers and soldiers followed orders. The logic was circular and inescapable. At 0200 hours on August 6, 1944, German commanders in forward positions gave the order to mount up. Tank engines coughed to life in the darkness, their distinctive rumble echoing across the Norman countryside. Infantry climbed aboard half-tracks and trucks, checking weapons one final time. Artillery crews loaded their guns, plotting coordinates for the opening barrage. Von Kluge, in his command post, miles behind the lines, listened to radio reports confirming that units were moving into their assault positions. The machinery of war was in motion now, beyond recall, committed to a course that logic said would fail. He thought about the young men in those tanks, in those trucks, moving forward into darkness toward an enemy that was waiting. He thought about Hitler in his bunker in East Prussia, studying maps that showed divisions that no longer existed, and dreaming of victories that would never come. He thought about himself, a professional soldier who had sworn an oath, caught between duty and disaster, honor and insanity. At 0600 hours, the artillery would fire. At 0630, the panzers would advance. And then they would discover whether courage and desperation could overcome arithmetic and reality. The final minutes before the attack stretched like hours in the minds of men who waited in the dark. Some prayed, some smoked, some stared at photographs of families they might never see again. A few tried to sleep, knowing rest would be impossible once battle began. Officers made last radio checks, ensured their units were in position, waited for the signal that would transform careful plans into violent chaos. The front was quiet in those final moments, almost peaceful, with only the distant rumble of artillery to the north breaking the pre-dawn stillness. In a few minutes, that silence would explode into fire and thunder, into screaming metal and dying men, into a battle that would prove once and for all that will and belief cannot overcome material reality. Operation Lüttich was about to begin. The impossible order was about to meet the immovable fact, and the German army was about to discover that some battles are lost before the first shot is fired. The men of the 30th Infantry Division arrived in Mortain on August 5, 1944, believing they were rotating into a quiet sector for rest. The division had been in continuous combat since D-Day, grinding through the hedgerows of Normandy in the kind of brutal close quarters fighting that consumed units faster than replacements could arrive. They had punched through German defences at Saint-Lô, supported Operation Cobra's breakthrough, and pursued retreating German forces until pursuit turned into exhaustion. When orders came to move into the Mortain sector, company commanders told their men they were getting a break. The Germans were retreating everywhere, the bocage fighting was over. A few days in a quiet town would give them time to absorb replacements, clean weapons, and sleep without artillery fire shaking them awake every hour. Mortain itself seemed to justify the optimism. The town sat in rolling Norman countryside, its medieval stone buildings clustered around a 12th century abbey and Gothic church. Apple orchards lined the approaches. Streams wandered through green valleys. It was the kind of place that appeared on postcards before the war, untouched by the mechanized slaughter that had consumed Europe since 1939. The local population, cautious but relieved to see Americans instead of Germans, emerged from cellars to offer wine and cider. Children gathered around American trucks, practicing their English, begging for chocolate. For soldiers who had spent 2 months watching friends die in muddy hedgerows, Mortain looked like paradise. They dug their foxholes in the rocky Norman soil without much conviction, more from habit than from any real expectation they would need them. The defensive positions established by the 30th Division revealed the hasty nature of their deployment and the chronic shortage of manpower that plagued Allied forces despite their material superiority. The division was responsible for holding a frontage of more than 20 miles, nearly triple the distance recommended by doctrine for a defensive position. Company positions were separated by gaps measured in miles, not yards. Platoons occupied strong points that could not provide mutual support. The 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry Regiment was assigned to hold Hill 314, a prominent elevation east of Mortain that dominated the surrounding countryside. Major Maurice Herlong, the battalion commander, surveyed his position on the afternoon of August 5th and noted several troubling facts. The hill provided excellent observation, which was good. It was surrounded by lower ground on all sides, which was very bad. If the Germans attacked in force, his battalion would be isolated. If the Germans bypassed the hill, his battalion would be trapped. He radioed his concerns to regimental headquarters. The response was reassuring and wrong. Intelligence indicated the Germans were retreating, not attacking. Hold position and await further orders. The intelligence picture available to American commanders at Mortain was simultaneously accurate and fatally incomplete. Ultra intercepts had revealed German plans for an offensive in the Mortain sector with unusual clarity. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had decoded Hitler's directive to von Kluge, had tracked the movement of panzer divisions, had even identified some of the units designated for the attack. This intelligence had been passed to Bradley's headquarters, where staff officers recognized it as an opportunity rather than a threat, but the information did not filter down to division level with the urgency it deserved. The 30th Division knew that enemy activity was possible. They did not know that 4 panzer divisions with 200 tanks were massing less than 5 miles away. They did not know that the attack would come at dawn the next morning. They did not know that they had been positioned, whether deliberately or accidentally, at the exact point where German armour would hit with maximum force. The decision to keep the 30th Division in place rather than reinforce it or pull it back has been debated by historians ever since. Some argue that Bradley deliberately used the division as bait, knowing that German forces concentrating for an attack could later be encircled and destroyed. Others suggest it was simply a miscalculation, a failure to appreciate the speed of German preparations or the weight of the coming assault. Bradley himself was characteristically vague in his post-war memoirs, describing his reasoning in terms of calculated risk and strategic opportunity. What is clear is that on the evening of August 5th, American soldiers at Mortain were positioned in the path of a major German offensive, understrength, overextended, and largely unaware of the storm about to break over them. They had been in position for less than 36 hours. They did not know the terrain well. They had not had time to register artillery concentrations or prepare elaborate defensive works. When the German attack came, they would fight on ground they barely knew against an enemy whose strength they did not suspect. The 700 men of 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry on Hill 314 represented a cross-section of the American Army in 1944. Most were draftees, ordinary men from ordinary towns who had been transformed into soldiers by necessity. There were farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from California, immigrants who had arrived in America only to be drafted into its wars. They had trained together, fought together, and formed the kind of bonds that only shared danger creates. Their officers were mostly citizen soldiers themselves, men who had been insurance salesmen and school teachers in civilian life, who had learned leadership through correspondence courses and battlefield experience. They were not elite troops, they were not specially selected, they were simply American infantry, the kind of men who had won every American war by accepting whatever mission they were given and accomplishing it through stubbornness, firepower, and a refusal to admit defeat. Weather conditions on the evening of August 5th were perfect for the Germans and ominous for the Americans. The forecast called for clear skies on August 6th, which meant Allied aircraft would be able to fly, but the attack was planned for pre-dawn, which meant the Germans would have several hours of darkness to achieve breakthrough before American fighters could respond. The moon was waning, providing just enough light for tank navigation, but not enough to silhouette attacking vehicles. A light ground fog was predicted for the early morning hours, which would reduce visibility and confuse defenders. Von Kluge's staff, planning the operation, had noted with satisfaction that the weather would give them perhaps 3 hours of advantage before Allied air power made daytime movement suicidal. American commanders, studying the same forecast, saw clear skies as a guarantee that any German attack would be crushed by fighter bombers. Neither side was wrong. Both would be proven partially right. As darkness fell on August 5th, American soldiers on Hill 314 settled into their positions for what they expected to be another quiet night. Sentries were posted at intervals around the perimeter, peering into the darkness for movement that never came. The rest of the battalion tried to sleep, curled in foxholes, wrapped in shelter halves against the evening chill. Radio operators maintained contact with company positions, reporting at intervals that all was quiet. Artillery observers checked their equipment, ensuring they could call fire if needed. Medical teams prepared their aid stations, hoping they would not be needed. In the town of Mortain below, more soldiers slept in houses and barns, enjoying real roofs over their heads for the first time in weeks. Company kitchens prepared to serve hot breakfast in the morning, a luxury that seemed possible in this quiet sector. Everything was peaceful, everything was ready, and 2 miles away, 210 German tanks were moving into position in the darkness. The final hours before dawn on August 6, 1944, passed in the innocent sleep of men who did not know they were about to be tested beyond anything they could imagine. Some would acquit themselves with courage that would earn medals and memorials. Some would break under stress that no training could prepare them for. Some would die in the first minutes of combat, killed before they fully woke from sleep, before they could understand what was happening. Others would survive the battle only to carry its scars for the rest of their lives, waking decades later from nightmares of German tanks emerging from morning fog, of friends dying in foxholes, of a hill that became a hell. They were ordinary men, positioned by chance or design at a point where history would pivot. In a few hours, they would discover what they were made of, whether they would stand or run, whether courage was a choice or a reflex. The Battle of Mortain was about to begin. And for the Americans sleeping peacefully in Norman fields, ignorant and unprepared, the awakening would be terrible. At precisely 0600 hours on August 6, 1944, the German artillery barrage shattered the pre-dawn stillness around Mortain. The first shells screamed over American positions and exploded with the distinctive crump of 150mm howitzers, throwing up geysers of earth and fire. Soldiers jerked awake in their foxholes, fumbling for helmets and weapons, trying to orient themselves in darkness and chaos. The barrage was brief, only 15 minutes, limited by ammunition shortages that plagued German forces throughout Normandy. But it was terrifyingly effective, walking across American positions with methodical precision, seeking out command posts and communication trenches. Telephone lines were cut, radio antennas were blown down, men died in their foxholes, killed before they could move, before they could fight back, before they had time to be afraid. In 15 minutes of thunder and steel, the American defensive position at Mortain was transformed from organized to chaotic. The fog that rolled across the Norman countryside in the minutes after the barrage lifted was both natural and providential for the German attackers. Ground mist, thickened by smoke from exploding shells and morning dew, reduced visibility to less than 50 yards in some areas. American sentries peered into the greyness and saw nothing, heard nothing except the fading echoes of artillery and the ringing in their ears. Then they heard the engines. It was a sound every veteran of Normandy knew instantly. The distinctive growl of German tank engines, the metallic squeal of tank tracks on pavement, the grinding roar of an armoured formation on the move. Red flares shot into the sky, warning signals hastily fired by sentries. Officers shouted commands. Machine gunners traversed their weapons towards sounds they could not see. And then the fog parted and the tanks appeared, massive shapes materializing like steel ghosts, Panther and Panzer Mark IV tanks advancing in line, their long guns seeking targets, their machine guns already firing into the mist. The 2nd Panzer Division hit Mortain town with the full weight of 55 tanks and 2,000 infantry, a force large enough to overwhelm the understrength American companies defending the position. The lead tanks rolled through the outskirts at 0645, crushing barbed wire obstacles, firing high explosive rounds into buildings where American soldiers had taken cover. House-to-house fighting erupted immediately, vicious, close-quarters combat in narrow streets where tanks were both vulnerable and deadly. American infantry fired bazookas from windows and alleys, aiming for the thin side armor where German tanks were weakest. Some shots hit and penetrated, brewing up tanks in spectacular fireballs. More shots missed or bounced off sloped armor, and the tanks returned fire with 75mm guns that turned stone houses into rubble. Within 30 minutes, the Germans had penetrated to the center of Mortain. Within an hour, organized American resistance in the town had collapsed into isolated pockets, fighting for survival. On Hill 314, Major Maurice Herlong watched the town below disappear into smoke and listened to frantic radio messages from units being overrun. His battalion was supposed to be holding a defensive position. Instead, in the space of an hour, they had been transformed into a surrounded garrison. German tanks had bypassed the hill to the north and south, cutting the roads leading back to American lines. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, following behind the initial assault, had been diverted to contain the Americans on the hill, surrounding it with infantry and preparing assault forces. Herlong's radio operator sent an urgent message to regimental headquarters: "Enemy tanks in strength moving on our position. We are surrounded." The response was terse and unhelpful. "Hold your position. Relief will be sent as soon as possible." Herlong looked at his officers and saw the same realization in their faces. Relief might come tomorrow or next week. In the meantime, they were alone. The chaos of the first 2 hours of battle revealed how thoroughly German surprise had disrupted American defensive plans and how quickly the offensive was already diverging from Hitler's expectations. American companies at l'Abbé Blanche, a small hamlet northwest of Mortain, were overrun in the first German rush, suffering more than 300 casualties in less than an hour. German tanks broke through and continued west, reaching a depth of 5 miles by 0900 hours. It looked like breakthrough. It felt like success. But radio reports reaching German forward commanders told a more complicated story. The 1st SS Panzer Division, attacking north of Mortain towards St. Barthélemy, had encountered unexpected resistance from American tank destroyer units and was stalled. The 116th Panzer Division, supposed to be advancing on a parallel axis, had been delayed by traffic jams and was still not in position. Most troubling of all, German casualties were already heavier than expected. American artillery, firing from positions that German intelligence had not identified, was dropping devastating barrages on advancing German columns. The Americans were supposed to be retreating. Instead, they were fighting. By 0800 hours, the German offensive had achieved tactical surprise but was already losing operational momentum. 5 miles penetration sounded impressive until measured against the objective. Avranches was 30 miles away, still an entire day's march through enemy-held territory. German tank companies that had started the attack with full fuel loads were already consuming reserves as combat maneuvering burned gasoline faster than planned. Casualties among tank commanders who fought with their heads exposed for better visibility were disproportionately high, disrupting the careful coordination required for combined arms warfare. And American reinforcements were already moving toward the battle, alerted by the sound of combat, if not by clear intelligence. The American 3rd Armored Division's Combat Command B, positioned 15 miles away, received movement orders at 0730. The American 35th Infantry Division began moving units toward Mortain. The window of German surprise was closing faster than planners had anticipated. The experience of individual soldiers in the first hours of Mortain illustrated the chaos that theory and planning could never capture. An American private in a foxhole near Mortain town described firing his Montgarand rifle at German infantry advancing through the fog, seeing men fall, then being forced to retreat when tanks appeared, and began firing directly into his position. He ran through streets, transformed into kill zones, bullets cracking past his head, finally diving into a cellar where a dozen other Americans had gathered. They had no officer, no clear orders, no idea what was happening beyond their immediate surroundings. They held that cellar for 6 hours, fighting off 3 German attempts to clear the building until ammunition ran out and they surrendered. A German tank commander with the 2nd Panzer Division described the exhilaration of the initial advance, the thrill of watching American positions collapse, followed by the shock of encountering American tank destroyers that systematically picked off his company's tanks from concealed positions. By noon, 8 of his company's 15 tanks were burning wrecks. He abandoned his own tank after it was hit and disabled, gathered his surviving crew, and spent the next 2 days trying to walk back to German lines. The confusion extended to the highest levels of command, where neither side had clear understanding of what was actually happening. Von Kluge, at his headquarters, received optimistic initial reports that Mortain had fallen and the advance was continuing west. He drafted a message to Hitler reporting success, breakthrough, and continuing exploitation. But even as he wrote, counter reports began arriving that painted a different picture. Heavy resistance at St. Barthélemy. Advance stalled north of Mortain. American artillery fire heavier than expected. Allied air activity beginning despite early hour. Von Kluge hesitated, then decided to send the optimistic report. Hitler wanted good news. The offensive had barely begun. Perhaps the situation would improve. At Bradley's headquarters, staff officers studied fragmentary reports from the 30th Division and tried to understand the scope of the German attack. Was this a major offensive or a local counterattack? Were the Germans attacking to break through or to cover a retreat? How many tanks were actually involved? The ultra-intercepts had predicted an attack, but intelligence could not capture the friction and confusion of actual combat. By mid-morning, both sides were flying blind, making decisions based on incomplete information, hoping they were doing the right thing. By noon on August 6th, the first phase of the Battle of Mortain was complete. The Germans had achieved surprise, penetrated American lines, captured important terrain. They had not achieved breakthrough. The Americans had suffered heavy casualties, lost positions, seen units surrounded and destroyed. They had not collapsed. Both sides were now committed to a battle neither fully understood, with stakes neither had fully calculated. The fog that had concealed the German attack was burning off in the August heat, revealing a battlefield littered with burning vehicles, dead soldiers, and the wreckage of plans. Allied fighter bombers were beginning to circle overhead, drawn by the smoke and reports of enemy armor. German commanders, watching the sky nervously, knew their window of opportunity was closing. American commanders, assessing the damage, knew the crisis was just beginning. Hill 314 stood isolated in enemy territory, surrounded, outnumbered, but still fighting. Mortain town had changed hands but remained contested, and 30 miles to the west, Avranches remained as distant and unreachable as Berlin. The battle that was supposed to change everything had barely begun, and already it was changing nothing except the location where men would die. By 1000 hours on August 6, 1944, General der Panzertruppen Hans Freiherr von Funk sat in his forward command post near Mortain and confronted a truth that Hitler would not want to hear. Operation Lüttich, barely 4 hours old, was already failing. Radio reports from his divisional commanders described stalled advances, heavier resistance than expected, and rising casualties. The 2nd Panzer Division, which was supposed to be halfway to Avranches by now, had covered only 7 miles and was reporting intense American artillery fire from positions that should not have existed. The 116th Panzer Division was bogged down at St. Barthélemy, where American tank destroyers were methodically destroying German armor from concealed positions. The 1st SS Panzer Division had lost 8 tanks in the first hour of combat and was requesting permission to halt and reorganize. Von Funk looked at his situation map and saw arrows that should have been racing west but were instead pointing at enemy strongpoints they could not bypass. The problem was not courage or determination. German soldiers were fighting with the skill and aggression that had made the Wehrmacht legendary. The problem was arithmetic and logistics, the unglamorous mathematics of modern war that no amount of will could overcome. German tanks were burning fuel at rates 50% higher than planning estimates, forced to maneuver constantly to avoid American fire, climbing hills, detouring through woods, running engines at high power under combat conditions. By midday, some tank companies were already down to 30% fuel reserves, which meant they had perhaps 25 miles of tactical movement remaining. The distance to Avranches was still 23 miles through enemy-held territory. The distance back to German starting positions was 7 miles through territory that Americans were already counterattacking into. The operational margin for error had disappeared. Every mile forward now consumed fuel that might be needed for withdrawal. Every tank lost to combat or breakdown reduced the offensive power available for the next phase. Von Funk drafted a carefully worded situation report to progress slower than hoped, enemy resistance strong, continuing attack. The American response to the German offensive demonstrated both the flexibility of American doctrine and the material superiority that underlay all Allied operations in 1944. Within hours of the initial attack, American artillery battalions throughout the sector were shifting fire plans, registering new targets, coordinating massive fire missions against German concentrations. The American doctrine of centralized artillery control meant that a forward observer on Hill 314 could call down fire from artillery batteries miles away, even from batteries belonging to different divisions. By noon, American artillery was firing coordinated time-on-target missions, timed so that shells from multiple batteries arrived on German positions simultaneously, giving no warning and no chance to take cover. German unit commanders reported artillery fire more intense than anything they had experienced in Normandy, comparing it to the worst barrages on the Eastern Front. The Americans were not just defending, they were counterattacking with fire. The absence of Luftwaffe air support transformed from disadvantage to catastrophe as morning progressed into afternoon. The clear skies that meteorologists had predicted meant perfect conditions for Allied tactical air power, and American and British fighter bombers responded with enthusiasm. By 1100 hours, P-47 Thunderbolts from the 9th Air Force were circling over Mortain, their pilots radioing for targets. By noon, RAF Typhoons armed with 60-pound rockets were diving on German tank columns. The initial strikes were tentative, pilots adjusting to the confused battlefield situation, unsure what targets were friendly and what were enemy, but by early afternoon, the attacks intensified. German soldiers described the terror of watching Allied fighters circle overhead like hawks, then suddenly dive, screaming down with rockets and cannons blazing. Tank crews learned to scatter at the first sound of aircraft engines, abandoning their vehicles and diving for ditches. Trucks and half-tracks pulled off roads into tree cover. The German advance, which depended on speed and momentum, slowed to a crawl as units sought cover instead of closing with the enemy. The American tank destroyer doctrine, developed through painful experience in North Africa and Italy, proved devastatingly effective at Mortain. American tank destroyer battalions were equipped with M10 Wolverines and M36 Jacksons, thinly armoured but highly mobile vehicles mounting powerful 76mm and 90mm guns. Their tactical doctrine emphasized mobility in ambush, allowed German tanks to advance past prepared positions, then attack from the flanks and rear where armor was weakest. At St. Barthélemy, a single American tank destroyer platoon accounted for 8 German tanks in 3 hours, firing from concealed positions, displacing before German return fire could find them, then firing again from new positions. German tank commanders, trained in the aggressive tactics that had won victories in 1940, found themselves fighting an enemy that refused decisive engagement, that traded space for kills, that turned every hedgerow into a potential ambush site. The frustration was tactical and psychological. How could you win a battle against an enemy you could not bring to decisive combat? By 1400 hours, von Kluge at Army Group B headquarters was receiving reports that forced him to confront an uncomfortable reality. The offensive was not achieving breakthrough. Territory gained in the first hours was being contested or retaken. Casualties were mounting faster than planned. fuel consumption was critical, and Allied air activity was increasing every hour. Von Kluge faced a decision that would define his command and possibly his survival. He could tell Hitler the truth: the offensive had failed to achieve its objectives and should be called off. Or he could report that progress was being made, that objectives would be achieved with additional effort, that success was just a matter of time. Von Kluge had seen what happened to generals who brought Hitler bad news. He had seen officers relieved, court-martialed, even executed for defeatism. He was a professional soldier, a man who had commanded armies for 4 years. But he was also a man who wanted to live. He drafted his report to Rastenburg with careful ambiguity. Initial objectives secured. Continuing operations toward Avranches. Enemy resistance heavier than expected but being overcome. We'll report further progress tomorrow. The truth that von Kluge's report obscured was that Operation Lüttich had exhausted its offensive potential within 6 hours of launch. German forces had penetrated American lines but had not broken through them. They had captured ground but could not advance further without prohibitive casualties. They had demonstrated tactical skill but could not overcome material disadvantages. By evening of August 6th, every German commander at division level and above understood that the offensive could not succeed as originally planned. The question now was whether it would transform into something else: a limited spoiling attack, a fighting withdrawal, a defensive battle, or whether it would simply grind forward until fuel and ammunition ran out. No one wanted to be the officer who said the operation should stop. So the operation continued, soldiers dying to buy time for someone higher up to make the decision to stop sending them forward. The American 30th Division, battered but not broken, began organizing counterattacks by mid-afternoon of August 6th. The 35th Infantry Division, moving into position on the 30th's flanks, prepared to pinch off the German salient. The 3rd Armored Division's Combat Command B assembled task forces to strike at German supply lines. Bradley, at his headquarters, studied the developing situation and recognized it as an opportunity rather than a crisis. If the Germans were committed to an offensive at Mortain, they were not retreating elsewhere. If they were concentrating their remaining armour in one location, they were vulnerable to encirclement everywhere else. Bradley began drafting orders for Patton's Third Army to swing north, to get behind the German forces at Mortain, to close a trap that could destroy the entire German army in France. The battle at Mortain was becoming the battle for Normandy, and the Germans, focused on an objective they could not reach, were walking deeper into a trap they could not see. As darkness fell on August 6th, exhausted soldiers on both sides collapsed into whatever cover they could find. The first day of the Battle of Mortain had cost the Germans approximately 2,400 casualties and 48 tanks destroyed or abandoned. American losses were heavier in absolute numbers, more than 600 killed, wounded, or captured, but lighter as a percentage of forces engaged. More importantly, American losses were being replaced. The 3rd Armored Division was bringing forward 150 tanks. Infantry replacements were arriving from rear areas. Artillery ammunition, expended at prodigious rates during the day, was being resupplied from vast dumps accumulated over months. The American army could afford to trade losses at rates that would have bankrupted the Germans. It was a cruel arithmetic, measured in young men's lives, but it was the arithmetic that would decide the war. On Hill 314, 700 Americans settled in for their first night of siege, unaware they would be surrounded for 6 more days. In Mortain town, German and American soldiers occupied opposite ends of the same streets, sometimes separated by only a few buildings, listening to each other in the darkness, waiting for morning to resume killing. And at headquarters, on both sides, generals studied maps and drafted orders, trying to shape chaos into strategy, trying to impose order on a battle that had already escaped everyone's control. Major Maurice Herlong stood on the summit of Hill 314 at dawn on August 7th, 1944, and surveyed a situation that would have seemed impossible 24 hours earlier. His battalion, 700 men of the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment, was completely surrounded by German forces. Every road leading off the hill was cut. Every approach was covered by enemy machine guns. German infantry had established positions within 500 yards of the American perimeter on all sides. Worse, German artillery had begun registering fire on the hill, walking shells across the slopes in methodical patterns, seeking out American positions. The battalion had ammunition for perhaps 2 days of heavy combat, food for 3 days if rationed carefully. Water was critically short, dependent on a few springs within the perimeter that German fire could interdict. Medical supplies were adequate for minor wounds, but wholly insufficient for the casualties Herlong knew were coming. He gathered his company commanders and delivered the orders with a calmness he did not feel. "We hold this hill. We do not withdraw. Relief will come. Until then, we fight." The value of Hill 314 became apparent within hours of the siege beginning. From the summit, American artillery observers could see for more than 20 miles across the Norman countryside. They could observe German supply columns moving along distant roads. They could watch tank formations assembling in valleys. They could spot German artillery positions preparing to fire. Most importantly, they could call down devastating accurate artillery fire on everything they saw. Lieutenant Ralph Curley, a forward observer from the 929th Field Artillery Battalion, established his observation post in a ruined stone house on the eastern crest of the hill. From this position, with binoculars and radio, he became one of the most valuable American assets in the entire battle. By noon on August 7th, Curley had called in fire missions that destroyed 16 German trucks, disabled 3 tanks, and scattered 2 infantry companies attempting to bypass the hill. German commanders, watching their carefully concealed movements suddenly explode under American shell fire, realized with growing fury that the Americans on the hill could see everything. The German response to the American presence on Hill 314 revealed both military logic and emotional obsession. From a purely tactical perspective, the Germans should have bypassed the hill entirely, masking it with minimal forces while pushing their main effort west toward Avranches. The Americans on the hill posed no direct threat to German armor advancing on roads to the north and south. But the indirect threat, the devastating artillery fire that Curley and other observers were directing onto German positions throughout the sector, made the hill impossible to ignore. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, diverted from its westward advance to deal with the hill, committed first one company, then a battalion, then most of a regiment to reducing the American position. What should have been a minor tactical problem became a major operational commitment, draining German strength away from the primary objective and into a siege battle against determined defenders on favourable terrain. The first German assault on Hill 314 came on the afternoon of August 7th, a probing attack by infantry supported by mortar fire. 2 companies of SS Panzer Grenadiers advanced up the southern slope, moving in short rushes from cover to cover, suppressing American positions with machine gun fire. They made it within 200 yards of the American perimeter before running into interlocking fields of fire from American machine guns and rifle positions. The Americans had spent their first day of encirclement improving fighting positions, sighting weapons to cover approaches, establishing kill zones where attackers would have no cover. The German assault stalled under withering fire, soldiers going to ground, unable to advance or retreat. American artillery, called in by the very observers the Germans were trying to eliminate, began dropping shells on the assault force. Within 30 minutes, the attack collapsed, survivors withdrawing down the slope, leaving 40 dead and wounded behind. The Germans had learned that Hill 314 would not fall to a hasty attack. They began preparing for something more serious. Supply became the critical factor, determining whether the surrounded battalion could hold. American C-47 cargo aircraft attempted supply drops starting on August 8th, flying through intense German anti-aircraft fire to drop ammunition, food, medical supplies, and water to the besieged garrison. The drops were partially successful and partially tragic. Pilots, flying low and slow to ensure accuracy, took heavy fire from German positions surrounding the hill. 1 aircraft was shot down, killing the entire crew. Supplies scattered across the landscape as parachutes drifted on the wind, with only about 30% landing inside the American perimeter. German soldiers recovered medicine, ammunition, and food intended for the defenders, adding insult to the material loss. The Americans watched precious supplies land just outside their lines, so close they could see individual crates, but under such heavy German fire, that recovery was impossible. By August 9th, the battalion was down to critical shortages. Water was rationed to 1 canteen per man per day. Food was reduced to 1 meal daily. Ammunition was limited to essential defense only. The medical situation on Hill 314 transformed from difficult to desperate as casualties mounted and supplies dwindled. Captain James Carey, the battalion surgeon, established his aid station in a farmhouse basement within the American perimeter. By August 8th, he was treating more than 50 wounded men in a space designed for a family cellar. By August 9th, the wounded numbered over 100, many with serious injuries, requiring surgery that Carey could not perform. Morphine ran out on August 10th. Sulfur drugs, essential for preventing infection, were exhausted. Carey and his medics operated without anesthesia, holding men down while extracting shrapnel, setting broken bones, amputating shattered limbs. The screams of wounded men under the knife haunted soldiers across the perimeter. Some of the wounded died from injuries that would have been survivable with proper medical care. Others clung to life through sheer willpower, waiting for relief that did not come. Carey wrote in his journal on August 10th, "We are out of everything except determination. I do not know how much longer we can sustain casualties at this rate." The psychological dynamics of the siege affected both defenders and attackers in complex ways. For the Americans on the hill, the situation was desperate but clear: hold position or die. The simplicity of the mission removed ambiguity and focused every effort on survival and resistance. Soldiers who might have broken under other circumstances found reserves of courage they did not know they possessed. Company commanders reported instances of extraordinary heroism: riflemen holding positions alone after their squads were killed, machine gunners firing until their barrels glowed red, medics exposing themselves to fire to reach wounded men. But there were also moments of fear and despair. Soldiers wrote final letters to families, certain they would not survive. Some prayed, some wept quietly in their foxholes. All of them watched the approaches to the hill and waited for the attack they knew was coming. For the Germans surrounding the hill, the psychological effect was different and more corrosive. They could see the Americans trapped on the hilltop. They outnumbered the defenders. They had tanks and artillery. Yet the hill did not fall. Every assault was repulsed. Every attempt to storm the position failed. The Americans seemed to have unlimited artillery support, unlimited will to resist. German casualties in attacks on Hill 314 exceeded 200 men in 3 days, with nothing to show for it except dead soldiers and disabled tanks. Lieutenant Ralph Curley's radio messages from Hill 314 became legendary examples of American determination under fire. On August 9th, when German forces launched their most serious assault yet, Curley radioed, "Enemy infantry in company strength, attacking from northeast. Request immediate fire mission." When asked if the battalion could hold, Curley replied, "We are holding, we will continue to hold. Send ammunition." On August 10th, as supplies reached critical levels, his message was more desperate. "Ammunition nearly gone, water exhausted, medical supplies critical. What is your plan for relief?" The response from regimental headquarters was as stark as the situation: "Hold at all costs. Relief forces are being organised. ETA unknown. You are performing invaluable service directing artillery. Hold." Curley's last message before radio batteries began failing on August 11th was characteristic: "Still holding, still fighting, still directing fire. Send help soon." By August 11th, the siege of Hill 314 had become psychologically significant, far beyond its tactical importance. For the Americans, the surrounded battalion represented everything about their army's character: stubbornness, resilience, refusal to surrender, even in desperate circumstances. Press reports reaching the United States spoke of the lost battalion holding out against overwhelming odds, evoking memories of the First World War. For the Germans, the hill became an obsession, a symbol of resistance that mocked their offensive pretensions. How could they claim to be attacking Avranches when they could not even capture a single hill defended by 700 infantry? The 2nd SS Panzer Division committed more and more resources to reducing the position, resources that should have been employed in the primary offensive mission. By the 5th day of the siege, German forces around Hill 314 included 2 infantry regiments, a battalion of artillery, and elements of 2 panzer companies. More than 4,000 men were tied down, besieging 700. The tactical absurdity was obvious to every German officer involved, but no one could authorize withdrawal. To abandon the siege would be to admit defeat, so the siege continued, consuming German strength, achieving nothing. The endurance of the men on Hill 314 under conditions that should have broken them illustrated what soldiers could survive when leadership remained steady and purpose remained clear. By August 12th, the battalion had been surrounded for 6 days. Casualties exceeded 300, nearly 50% of the original garrison. The survivors were exhausted, hungry, dehydrated, and low on ammunition. Many were wounded themselves but continued fighting because there was no choice. They had watched friends die. They had buried men in shallow graves, scratched into rocky soil. They had lived with the constant fear that, The next German assault would be the one that broke through, that overran their positions, that ended in death or capture. Yet when German infantry attempted another assault on August 11th, the Americans repulsed it with the same determination they had shown on day one. Company commanders reported that morale remained surprisingly high. Soldiers joked grimly about their situation, calling themselves von Herlong's Luftwaffe, because they were an island in German-controlled sky. They rationed their last cigarettes, their last rations, their last rounds of ammunition, with the careful calculation of men who expected to need them, and they waited for relief, believing it would come because they had been told it would come because they had to believe something. The evening report that reached Adolf Hitler's headquarters at Rastenburg on August 6, 1944, carefully described Operation Lüttich's first day in terms calculated to satisfy the Führer without actually lying. Mortain had been captured, American positions had been penetrated, German forces were advancing west, resistance was being overcome. The report did not mention that Avranches, the objective that Hitler considered critical, was still 23 miles away through enemy territory. It did not mention that German tank losses already exceeded projections. It did not mention that Allied aircraft had appeared in strength and were savaging German columns. Hitler read the report with satisfaction and summoned his staff to draft orders for the continuation and expansion of the offensive. What had worked, he reasoned, must be reinforced. What had achieved surprise must be exploited. More divisions would be committed. The attack would be renewed with greater strength. Victory was certain. Hitler's August 7th directive to von Kluge revealed the complete disconnect between the Führer's understanding and battlefield reality. The attack would be resumed immediately with additional forces. 4 more panzer divisions would be committed to the offensive. The 9th Panzer Division from southern France, the 116th Panzer Division would be reinforced. All available assault guns and tank destroyers would be concentrated for a renewed thrust. The objective remained unchanged. Drive to Avranches, cut American supply lines, destroy the Allied breakthrough. Hitler estimated that 1,000 tanks could be assembled for the renewed offensive within 48 hours. His staff, familiar with the Führer's arithmetical creativity, did not challenge the figure. They knew that the divisions Hitler was ordering forward did not exist at anything close to authorized strength. The 9th Panzer Division, transferring from southern France, had perhaps 35 operational tanks, not the 200 Hitler imagined. But questioning the Führer's numbers was career-ending at best and potentially life-ending. The orders were transmitted to Army Group B with the understanding that von Kluge would somehow make reality conform to fantasy. The telephone conversation between Hitler and von Kluge on August 7th, partially recorded by stenographers and partially reconstructed from participants' accounts, captured the impossible position of German field commanders in the final year of the war. Hitler opened by demanding to know why Avranches had not yet been reached. Von Kluge explained that American resistance was stronger than expected, that Allied air attacks were disrupting movement, that fuel supplies were critically low. Hitler interrupted repeatedly, insisting that these were excuses, that determined leadership could overcome material difficulties, that the will to win mattered more than statistics. Von Kluge tried to explain that the offensive had already exhausted its combat power, that continuing would only increase losses without achieving objectives. Hitler's response was brutal and revealing, "I don't want excuses, I want Avranches. If the current commanders cannot accomplish the mission, I will find commanders who can." The threat was unmistakable. Von Kluge could follow orders he knew would fail, or he could be relieved and possibly court-martialed for defeatism. He chose to follow orders. The German 9th Panzer Division received movement orders on August 8th to immediately transfer from positions near Toulouse in southern France to Mortain, a road distance of approximately 300 miles through territory completely dominated by Allied air power. The division's commander, Major General Gerhard Müller, read the orders with disbelief. His division had 35 operational tanks, 300 vehicles, and approximately 4,000 men. Moving this force 300 miles in summer, when Allied fighter bombers patrolled French skies in strength, was not a military operation but a suicide mission. Vehicles would have to move only at night, travelling perhaps 30 miles per night, hiding during daylight hours. The journey would take 10 days minimum, possibly 2 weeks. By the time they arrived at Mortain, if they arrived, the battle would be over. Müller protested through channels, was overruled, and began the movement. Within 48 hours, Allied aircraft had destroyed 60 vehicles and killed 200 men. The division straggled north, losing strength every night, arriving too late to effect anything. Von Kluge's personal crisis reached its breaking point during these days. He was 62 years old, a career officer from the old Prussian military tradition, a man who believed in duty, honor, and obedience. He had commanded armies in Poland, in France, in Russia. He had seen victory and defeat, triumph and disaster. He had watched the German army transform from the most powerful military force in Europe to a desperate assemblage of exhausted men and worn-out equipment, sustained only by Hitler's refusal to accept reality. Von Kluge had been implicated tangentially in the July 20th assassination plot against Hitler, aware that some of his subordinates were involved but not reporting them. The Gestapo knew, Hitler knew. Von Kluge commanded on sufferance, one mistake away from arrest. So, when Hitler ordered the impossible, von Kluge transmitted the orders to his subordinates and watched them try to accomplish the unaccomplishable. The British and Canadian forces launching Operation Totalize from the north on August 8th created a second crisis that von Kluge could not ignore. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding Allied ground forces, had recognized that German forces concentrated at Mortain were weak elsewhere. His attack from Caen toward Falaise hit German defensive positions with overwhelming artillery preparation and armoured strength. German units that should have been reinforcing Mortain were instead rushing north to prevent breakthrough. Von Kluge found himself fighting a two-front battle with forces adequate for neither front. Every panzer division committed to renewed attacks at Mortain was a division not available to stop the British advance. Every tank lost at Mortain was a tank that could not defend against encirclement. The strategic situation was collapsing, but Hitler's orders permitted no retreat, no withdrawal, no acknowledgement of reality. The offensive must continue. Avranches must be reached. Victory was certain. German casualties during August 6th through 8th, the first 72 hours of Operation Lüttich, exceeded 4,000 men, killed, wounded, or missing. Tank losses approached 90, vehicles destroyed, damaged, or abandoned. Fuel consumption had been 60% higher than planned rates, leaving operational vehicles with critically low reserves. Artillery ammunition, already scarce before the offensive began, was nearly exhausted. The German army in Normandy was consuming itself in an offensive that had failed to achieve breakthrough, failed to disrupt Allied operations, failed to accomplish any strategic objective. Yet Hitler's orders continued, demanding renewed attacks, additional commitments, greater efforts. The psychological effect on German commanders at all levels was corrosive. They could see failure. They could measure defeat in destroyed tanks and dead soldiers. But they could not admit it, could not stop it, could not even speak the truth to higher command without risking execution for defeatism. The final irony of Hitler's response to Mortain was that his insistence on continuing the offensive created exactly the strategic disaster that the offensive was supposed to prevent. By holding German forces in place at Mortain, fighting for objectives they could not reach, Hitler prevented the orderly withdrawal that might have saved his army. German forces that should have been establishing defensive lines east of the Seine River were instead attacking west toward Avranches. Panzer divisions that should have been conserved as mobile reserves were being ground down in attrition battles they could not win. Every day Hitler insisted on continuing the Mortain offensive was another day. Allied forces had to close the encirclement forming around the entire German army in Normandy. German intelligence officers could see it coming. Staff planners could calculate the closing dates. But no one could convince Hitler that continuation of the Mortain offensive was guaranteeing the catastrophe at Falaise. Von Kluge began drafting a letter on August 9th that he knew might be his last official communication. The letter, addressed to his subordinate commanders, carefully avoided direct criticism of Hitler but hinted at inevitable failure. We have accomplished much with limited resources. We have demonstrated that German soldiers remain capable of offensive operations even under adverse conditions. The enemy's material superiority creates challenges that courage alone cannot overcome. I have full confidence that every commander will continue to do his duty in the difficult days ahead. The language was formal, professional, emotionally restrained, but officers who knew von Kluge understood what he was communicating. The offensive had failed, disaster was approaching, and he expected most of them would not survive what was coming. Von Kluge sealed the letter, handed it to his adjutant for distribution and returned to drafting operations orders for offensives he knew would not succeed, to satisfy a Führer who would not listen, to serve a cause that was already lost. The morning briefing at RAF Station B10 near Caen on August 7, 1944, crackled with unusual intensity as pilots of 225 Squadron gathered around the operations board. Their Hawker Typhoons, single-seat fighter bombers armed with 420mm cannons and 8 60-pound rocket projectiles, had been waiting for exactly this kind of target. Intelligence had pinpointed German panzer concentrations at Mortain, armour grouped in the open, attacking west in daylight. The squadron commander's orders were simple and thrilling. Maximum effort. Target is German armour operating near Mortain. Visibility is excellent. Expect heavy flak, but limited fighter opposition. I want continuous attacks from now until dark. Hit them with everything. 24 Typhoons would form the first wave, attacking in 4-plane sections at intervals throughout the day. Pilots checked their maps, synchronized watches, and walked toward their aircraft with the careful calm of men about to fly into intense anti-aircraft fire. The Hawker Typhoon was not a beautiful aircraft, but it was brutally effective at its mission. Powered by a massive 24-cylinder Napier Sabre engine producing more than 2,000 horsepower, the Typhoon could carry twice the weapons load of most fighters while still maintaining respectable speed and maneuverability at low altitude. Its primary weapon for tank killing was the RP-3 rocket projectile, a 60-pound warhead mounted on a 3-inch steel tube, carried in groups of 8 under the wings. The rockets were not precision weapons, they were area effect weapons, terrifying in their power and psychological impact, even when accuracy was limited. A direct hit from an RP-3 could penetrate the top armour of any German tank. A near miss could still disable tracks, damage optics, or kill crew members through concussion. More importantly, the psychological effect of 8 rockets screaming down from above was devastating to soldiers who had no effective way to fight back. The first Typhoon attack on German positions at Mortain began at 09:30 hours on August 7th. 4 aircraft diving from 8,000 feet toward a column of 2nd Panzer Division tanks moving west along a secondary road. The attacking pilots could see their targets clearly. 15 to 20 tanks and half-tracks advancing in column formation, totally exposed on open roadway. The lead Typhoon pilot lined up his attack run, diving steeply to build speed, holding steady despite flak bursts beginning to bracket his aircraft. At 2,000 feet, he triggered his rockets, 8 projectiles rippling off the wing rails in quick succession, screaming downward trailing smoke. The pilot pulled hard on his stick, grunting against G-forces as his Typhoon climbed away from the target. Behind him, rockets impacted among the German column. 2 tanks exploded immediately, hit squarely by projectiles that penetrated top armour and detonated ammunition. 3 more vehicles were damaged, track assemblies destroyed or engines disabled. The surviving German crews abandoned their vehicles and scattered into ditches, having learned in seconds that movement in daylight meant death from above. Inside a German Panther tank of the 2nd Panzer Division, Unteroffizier Klaus Schmidt experienced the Typhoon attack from the receiving end. His tank was 4th in the column when the rockets hit. Schmidt described the attack in a letter he wrote 3 days later while recuperating from wounds. "We heard the aircraft engines first, a sound like tearing canvas, very loud and getting louder. Then someone shouted, 'Jubbo, fighter bomber.' I looked up through my periscope and saw 4 aircraft diving directly at us, growing larger every second. The commander ordered driver to scatter off-road, but we had no time. The rockets came with a sound like freight trains, like the universe screaming. 2 tanks ahead of us exploded. Something hit our tank, not directly, but close enough that we flipped onto our side. My leg was broken. The driver was dead. We climbed out through the escape hatch and ran. I looked back and saw my tank burning. The aircraft were gone. The whole attack took perhaps 30 seconds. By midday on August 7th, Allied fighter-bomber operations over Mortain had escalated to continuous attack patterns. RAF Typhoons and USAAF P-47 Thunderbolts maintained constant presence over the battlefield, aircraft arriving as others departed to rearm, maintaining pressure that never lifted. American P-47s carrying 850 caliber machine guns and bombs or rockets. Specialized in attacking soft-skinned vehicles, trucks, half-track carriers, artillery tractors, British Typhoons focused on armoured targets. Between them, Allied pilots flew more than 1,100 sorties against German positions at Mortain on August 7th alone, an intensity of air attack that German forces in Normandy had never experienced. German commanders issued orders prohibiting daylight movement of any vehicles. Units scattered into woods and buildings, hiding from aircraft they could not fight. The German offensive, which required speed and momentum, ground to a halt as soldiers learned that moving meant dying. The effectiveness of air attacks against armor was more psychological than statistical, a fact that did not make them less devastating. Post-battle analysis showed that Typhoon rockets achieved direct hits on tanks only about 5% of the time. Most rockets missed by yards or tens of yards. But a 5% hit rate against mass targets still meant destroyed vehicles, and the psychological effect of 8 rockets screaming down was paralyzing regardless of accuracy. German tank crews interviewed after the battle consistently described air attacks as the most terrifying experience of combat, worse than artillery, worse than anti-tank guns, worse than anything except perhaps Katyusha rocket attacks on the Eastern Front. The inability to fight back, the helplessness of sitting in a steel box while aircraft circled overhead selecting targets, the randomness of death from above, these factors combined to create terror that statistics could not measure but that operational effectiveness could not ignore. Allied pilots experienced their own challenges and casualties during the intense operations over Mortain. German anti-aircraft fire, though less sophisticated than later in the war, remained deadly at the low altitudes required for effective ground attack. 88mm flak guns, 20mm automatic cannons, and even small arms fire brought down Allied aircraft. 2 Typhoons were shot down on August 7th. 3 P-47s were lost. Pilots who survived described intense flak, coloured tracer, fire rising from every German position, the constant fear of taking hits while committed to attack runs that required flying straight and level for critical seconds. Flying Officer James Davidson of 225 Squadron survived being hit by flak that destroyed his Typhoon's hydraulics, forcing him to nurse his damaged aircraft back across Allied lines and belly land in a field. His report matter-of-factly described being hit controlling the damaged aircraft and landing safely, then concluded, aircraft destroyed. Request immediate replacement so I can return to operations. The American P-47 Thunderbolt pilots of the 9th Air Force approached ground attack missions with different tactics than their British counterparts, but equal effectiveness. The P-47, nicknamed Jug for its portly appearance, was arguably the most survivable fighter bomber of the war. Its massive radial engine and sturdy construction allowed it to absorb battle damage that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. American pilots used their aircraft's 850 caliber machine guns to devastating effect against soft targets, making low-level strafing runs that shredded German trucks, killed exposed infantry, and destroyed supply columns. Captain Robert Johnson of the 368th Fighter Group described attacking a German convoy near Mortain. We came in low, maybe 50 feet off the ground, 4 aircraft in line. The trucks were parked nose to tail on a narrow road, couldn't disperse, couldn't hide. We walked our fire down the column, 50 caliber rounds tearing through canvas and wood and men. Trucks exploded, men scattered. We made 3 passes before flak got too heavy, left the whole convoy burning. By evening of August 7th, the cumulative effect of more than 1,000 Allied air sorties had fundamentally changed the Battle of Mortain. German forces that should have been advancing west were instead hiding in woods and buildings, dispersed and static. German tank formations that had started the day with combat-ready vehicles now countered destroyed and damaged hulls littering roads and fields. German commanders reported that they could not move during daylight, could not concentrate forces, could not coordinate attacks. The offensive had been predicated on rapid movement and aggressive exploitation. Air attacks had removed the possibility of rapid movement. Without movement, there could be no breakthrough. Without breakthrough, the offensive had no purpose. Yet Hitler's orders still demanded continuation, still insisted on reaching Avranches, still refused to acknowledge that the sky belonged to the Allies, and the Allies were using that ownership to kill anyone who moved. The strategic implications of Allied air supremacy at Mortain extended far beyond the immediate battle. Every German soldier who experienced the Typhoon and Thunderbolt attacks learned that moving in daylight was suicidal. Every German commander who watched his carefully assembled formations scattered by air attack learned that conventional offensive operations were impossible without air cover. The lesson would be carried forward to every subsequent battle in northwestern Europe. From August 7th forward, German tactical doctrine in France emphasized night movement, extreme dispersion, and defensive operations that minimized exposure to air attack. The offensive capability of the Wehrmacht in the West, already limited by material shortages, was further crippled by psychological acceptance that the sky belonged to the enemy. Soldiers who believed that showing themselves meant death from above were soldiers who would not attack, would not advance, would not take risks that earlier German armies had considered routine. The Typhoons and Thunderbolts at Mortain did not just stop one offensive. They helped end the possibility of offensive warfare for Germany in the West. The third day of the Battle of Mortain began with renewed German attacks that accomplished nothing except to prove that determination could not overcome material disadvantage. August 8th, 1944, saw German forces throughout the sector attempting limited offensives, local counterattacks, small unit actions designed to maintain pressure on American positions. None achieved breakthrough. Most were repulsed with heavy casualties. The character of the battle had changed from mobile warfare to grinding attrition, from maneuver to slugfest, from strategy to pure violence. Soldiers on both sides found themselves engaged in the kind of brutal close-quarters combat that consumed men faster than armies could replace them. Towns changed hands, not because of clever maneuver, but because infantry fought room to room until one side had no more rooms to fight from. Hills were taken not through flanking attacks but through frontal assaults that left slopes covered with bodies. The battle had become what soldiers grimly called the grind. American infantry of the 35th Infantry Division, counterattacking towards St. Barthélemy on August 8th, experienced combat that resembled the Western Front of 1918 more than the mobile warfare that had liberated France. Attacking across open fields against German positions in hedgerows and stone buildings, American soldiers advanced by small teams using fire and movement tactics that emphasized suppression over accuracy. Machine gun teams would fire hundreds of rounds to keep German defenders down, while rifle squads rushed forward 20 or 30 yards, dove into cover, then became the base of fire for the next bound forward. Progress was measured in yards per hour. Casualties were measured in men per yard. By evening, the 35th Division had advanced 600 yards and suffered 90 casualties. The mathematics were brutal but clear. At this rate, reaching significant objectives would take weeks and cost thousands. But the attack continued because stopping meant conceding initiative to an enemy who was equally exhausted. German forces defending St. Barthélemy demonstrated that defensive operations, properly conducted, could inflict disproportionate casualties even on attacking forces with material superiority. Elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division dug into defensive positions with clear fields of fire, stopped American attacks repeatedly through disciplined fire and effective use of terrain. MG-42 machine guns, firing at cyclic rates exceeding 1,000 rounds per minute, created kill zones that American infantry could not cross. German mortars, pre-registered on likely approach routes, dropped high explosive and smoke shells that disrupted American coordination. German snipers, positioned in upper floors of stone buildings, picked off American officers and sergeants, targeting the leaders who made small unit tactics work. The Americans had more men, more ammunition, more artillery support. The Germans had better positions, interior lines, and the natural advantage of defenders who needed only to survive until dark, while attackers needed to advance or admit failure. Combat at this intensity produced casualties that overwhelmed medical systems on both sides. American battalion aid stations, designed to handle 20 to 30 wounded per day, were treating 60 to 80 during heavy fighting. Wounded men were triaged in hasty categories: immediate evacuation for life-threatening injuries, delayed evacuation for serious but non-critical wounds, return to duty for minor injuries. The category assignments were medical and cruel. A man shot through the hand was patched up and sent back to fight. A man shot through the chest was loaded onto a jeep for evacuation to a field hospital 10 miles rear. A man with abdominal wounds was given morphine and placed in the expectant category, medical terminology for will probably die before we can get him to surgery. Medical personnel worked without sleep, performing triage and treatment in bomb-damaged buildings, in tents, in open fields, wherever wounded men accumulated faster than ambulances could evacuate them. German medical challenges were worse, complicated by inability to evacuate wounded during daylight due to Allied air supremacy. Wounded German soldiers waited in battalion aid stations through the day, often without adequate painkillers, waiting for darkness when ambulances could move without being strafed. Serious casualties that required surgical intervention sometimes waited 24 hours or more before reaching field hospitals equipped to perform surgery. The Wehrmacht medical service, excellent by any objective standard, could not overcome the basic problem that moving wounded men required moving vehicles, and vehicles that moved in daylight died. German doctors trained to provide care equivalent to civilian hospitals found themselves operating under conditions that would have been considered barbaric in peacetime. Surgery by candlelight, operations without anesthesia, amputations without proper sterile technique. They saved many men who should have died. They watched many men die who should have been saved. The small unit actions that constituted most of the fighting from August 8th through 10th produced individual stories of courage, horror, and absurdity that statistics could never capture. An American squad from the 35th Division, clearing a Norman farmhouse held by German infantry, engaged in a room-by-room gunfight that lasted 40 minutes and left 11 men dead in a building measuring 40 feet by 30 feet. The survivors described combat at ranges measured in feet, sometimes hand-to-hand, grenades thrown through doorways, rifle shots at point-blank range, the surreal experience of killing men whose faces they could see clearly. A German machine gun team from the 2nd SS Panzer Division held a hedgerow position for 6 hours against repeated American attacks, expending more than 5,000 rounds of ammunition, stopping 3 separate assaults. When American artillery finally silenced the position with direct hit, 2 of the 3 crew were dead and the third was insane, gibbering incoherently, his mind broken by hours of killing. Artillery dominated the battlefield more than any other weapon system, and the American advantage in artillery was overwhelming. American doctrine concentrated artillery at corps level, allowing any forward observer to call fire from multiple battalions simultaneously. Time on target fire missions, coordinated so shells from different batteries arrived simultaneously, were particularly devastating. German officers described TOT missions as the most terrifying experience of modern war. Sudden, overwhelming, unavoidable destruction that gave no warning and no chance to take cover. One moment, a position was quiet. The next moment, the world exploded. American artillery expenditure during August 8th through 10th averaged 50,000 rounds per day, more shells than some armies fired in entire campaigns. German artillery, constrained by ammunition shortages and Allied counter-battery fire, could manage perhaps 10,000 rounds per day. The 5-to-1 American advantage in artillery meant that American infantry attacked under protective barrages that suppressed German defenders, while German infantry had to endure American artillery with inadequate response. The psychological strain of continuous combat began manifesting in what military psychiatrists of the era called combat fatigue, and what later generations would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. American medical personnel reported increasing cases of soldiers who stopped fighting not from physical wounds but from psychological breakdown. Men who had been reliable soldiers for weeks suddenly could not continue, weeping uncontrollably, shaking, unable to hold weapons. Some broke during combat, freezing in place or running to the rear. Others broke afterward. Reaction delayed until relative safety allowed suppressed emotions to surface. Military doctrine of 1944 viewed combat fatigue with suspicion, treating psychological casualties as potential malingerers, applying pressure to return men to duty quickly. The understanding that human beings had psychological limits to combat stress that were as real as physical limits was emerging but not yet widely accepted. German soldiers experienced combat fatigue, compounded by knowledge that the war was being lost. American soldiers could believe they were winning, that their sacrifices served a victorious cause, that survival meant eventual return home. German soldiers increasingly understood they were fighting to postpone defeat, not to achieve victory. The realization corroded morale in ways that discipline could not overcome. Soldiers who believed they were going to die anyway fought with fatalistic courage or simply stopped fighting, surrendering at first opportunity. German officers reported increasing difficulties motivating men to conduct offensive operations that seemed pointless. Defensive operations, fighting to protect comrades and survive another day, still evoked good performance. Attacking American positions that would be recaptured tomorrow anyway, dying to advance a few hundred yards that would be given back next week. These missions produced resentment and passive resistance that sometimes crossed into outright refusal. By August 10th, both sides at Mortain were exhausted. German forces had lost 90 tanks, 4,000 men, and most of their offensive capability. American forces had lost fewer men but more terrain temporarily, absorbing German attacks through defensive flexibility and counterattacking when opportunities appeared. Neither side controlled the battlefield in any meaningful sense. Towns and hills changed hands, sometimes repeatedly, without strategic consequence. The original German objective reaching Avranches had been completely abandoned, even if officially no one admitted it. The American objective stopping the German offensive had been achieved, but at cost that made victory feel hollow. Soldiers on both sides wanted the battle to end, wanted to stop killing and being killed over terrain that neither side particularly needed. But battles have their own momentum, their own logic, independent of original objectives. The Battle of Mortain continued because continuing was easier than finding a way to stop. General Omar Bradley stood before a wall-sized situation map at his headquarters on the evening of August 8, 1944, and experienced what he later described as a moment of strategic clarity. For 3 days, he had been focused on the immediate tactical problem: stopping the German attack at Mortain, reinforcing threatened positions, organizing counterattacks. Now, studying the map that showed German dispositions across all of Normandy, Bradley saw something bigger. The Germans were not just attacking at Mortain, they were concentrated at Mortain, committed to an offensive that had failed but that Hitler refused to abandon. Every German panzer division in Normandy was either engaged at Mortain or moving toward it, which meant that German forces everywhere else were weak, which meant that the trap everyone had discussed, theoretically, had suddenly become achievable practically. Bradley turned to his staff. How fast can Patton turn north? We're not fighting a battle at Mortain anymore. We're setting up to destroy the entire German army in France. The strategic situation that Bradley recognized had been developing for days, but only became clear when German dispositions were viewed at army group level rather than corps level. Field Marshal Montgomery's forces in the north, British and Canadian armies, were pushing south from Caen toward Falaise. Lieutenant General Patton's Third Army in the south had been racing west into Brittany but could easily turn north. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army were concentrated in a pocket between these two Allied forces, committed to offensive operations at Mortain that prevented them from establishing defensive positions further east. If Montgomery continued pushing south and Patton turned north, the two Allied armies would meet somewhere near Argentan or Falaise. Everything west of that meeting point, 100,000 German soldiers, hundreds of tanks, all the combat power of two German armies would be encircled. The opportunity was breathtaking in its magnitude and terrifying in its complexity. Coordinating two separate Allied army groups under different commands, operating on different plans, to converge on a single point required perfect timing and flawless execution. But the potential payoff was ending the Battle of France in one stroke. Lieutenant General George Patton received Bradley's order to turn north on August 9th with the enthusiasm of a man who had been waiting his entire career for such a mission. Patton's Third Army had been racing through Brittany for 10 days, capturing territory at rates measured in miles per hour, exploiting the German collapse with aggressive armoured thrusts that ignored flanks and supply lines. Now, Bradley was telling him to stop exploiting west and start exploiting north, to drive toward Argentan and Falaise, to close the trap on the Germans trapped at Mortain. Patton studied his maps and calculated that his 15th Corps, currently near Le Mans, could reach Argentan in 3 days if they pushed hard. His staff worried about exposed flanks, about supply lines stretched to breaking, about coordination with Montgomery's forces. Patton dismissed all concerns with characteristic confidence. I don't care about flanks. The Germans are trapped, and they don't even know it yet. We're going to close the door before they realize they need to get out. The coordination between American and British forces required to close what became known as the Falaise Gap tested Allied command relationships that had been strained since D-Day. Field Marshal Montgomery, commanding all Allied ground forces, was notoriously cautious, preferring carefully planned set-piece battles to improvised exploitation. General Bradley, commanding American forces, was more aggressive but also more diplomatic, trying to balance operational requirements with political realities of coalition warfare. General Patton, commanding Third Army, was openly contemptuous of Montgomery and willing to ignore orders if they interfered with killing Germans. Getting these three commanders to coordinate a complex pincer movement while fighting separate battles was like conducting an orchestra where each musician played different music. Yet somehow, through staff work and hard-won experience, the coordination happened. Montgomery's 21st Army Group would attack south toward Falaise. Bradley's 12th Army Group would attack north toward Argentan. When they met, the Falaise Gap would be closed, and the German army in Normandy would be destroyed. The German command structure was catastrophically slow to recognize the danger developing around them. Hitler's focus remained fixed on Mortain, on renewing the offensive, on reaching Avranches. The German field commanders could see Allied movements, could track the British advance south and the American turn north. But interpreting those movements required admitting that the Mortain offensive had not just failed but had become a trap. No one wanted to be the officer who told Hitler that his brilliant counteroffensive was guaranteeing the destruction of the entire German position in France. So, reports to higher command continued emphasizing tactical details at Mortain, while downplaying strategic disaster developing everywhere else. Von Kluge, caught between what he could see and what he could say, drafted situation reports that documented German positions without explicitly stating that those positions were about to be encircled. The logistical nightmare of the Falaise Gap operation extended far beyond tactical coordination. The Allies would be closing a pocket containing 100,000 German soldiers and all their equipment, tanks, artillery, trucks, ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies. Destroying or capturing that much combat power required sustaining intense combat operations over multiple days, while simultaneously preventing German breakout attempts. American and British artillery would need thousands of tons of ammunition, Allied aircraft would need to fly thousands of sorties, infantry would need to maintain pressure from multiple directions simultaneously, and all of this would have to happen in an area measuring roughly 40 miles long by 15 miles wide, congested with two Allied armies converging from different directions. Friendly fire incidents were inevitable. Traffic jams were guaranteed. Confusion was certain. But the potential reward, destroying the German capacity to defend France, justified any risk. Ultra-intelligence intercepts during early August provided Allied commanders with unprecedented insight into German command confusion and Hitler's refusal to authorize withdrawal. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park were reading German high command communications almost in real time, decoding messages between Hitler's headquarters and von Kluge's command post. The intercepts revealed that Hitler was still ordering offensive operations at Mortain, even as British forces approached Falaise and American forces turned north toward Argentan. The intercepts revealed that von Kluge was trying carefully and obliquely to suggest that withdrawal might be prudent. The intercepts revealed that Hitler was interpreting any suggestion of withdrawal as defeatism and threatening to relieve commanders who failed to attack aggressively. Allied planners reading these intercepts understood that German forces would remain in the pocket longer than military logic dictated because Hitler's orders prevented rational retreat. The longer Germans stayed, the tighter the trap became. By August 10th, the strategic picture was clear to everyone except Hitler. German forces were concentrated at Mortain, fighting an offensive that had no prospect of success. British forces were pushing south from Caen, approaching Falaise against weakening German resistance. American forces were racing north from Le Mans, approaching Argentan with only scattered German screening forces to oppose them. The gap between British and American forces was narrowing daily. German forces in the pocket had perhaps 48 to 72 hours to begin organised withdrawal before the gap closed completely. After that, withdrawal would become breakout fighting through encirclement, abandoning equipment, suffering catastrophic casualties. Von Kluge knew it, his staff knew it, every corps and division commander knew it, but no one could convince Hitler, and without Hitler's authorization, no one dared order general withdrawal. So German forces held their positions at Mortain, attacked when ordered, and waited for permission to retreat that came too late. Bradley's evening briefing on August 10th to his corps commanders outlined the operation with brutal simplicity. The Germans have walked into a trap. They're concentrated at Mortain, committed to an offensive that's going nowhere. Montgomery's pushing south, Patton is pushing north. When we meet, everything west of the meeting point is trapped. Our job is to close the gap fast, hold it tight, and destroy everything inside. This is the opportunity to end the Battle of France. We don't get many chances like this. We're not going to waste it. Corps commanders asked about coordination, about boundaries, about what happened if the Germans tried to break out. Bradley's answers were confident and vague. Coordination would be worked out at lower levels. Boundaries would be established as forces converged. If Germans tried to break out, Allied forces would kill them during the attempt. The plan had gaps and ambiguities and assumptions that might not hold, but the strategic logic was undeniable. The Germans were trapped, the Allies were closing in, and the Battle of Mortain, which had started as a German offensive toward Avranches, was about to become the battle that destroyed German power in France. Madame Odette Lefebvre emerged from the cellar of her home in Mortain on the morning of August 12, 1944, after 7 days of hiding from the battle raging above. She was 62 years old, a widow who had lived through one German occupation in the First World War and now found herself trapped in another German invasion during the Second. The stairway from her cellar to the ground floor was blocked by rubble where her kitchen had been. She climbed out through a coal chute and stood in what had been her street, seeing devastation that made her weep. Every building showed damage. Most were destroyed completely, reduced to rubble and burned timbers. The medieval church where she had been baptized 72 years earlier was a roofless shell, its stone walls pocked with thousands of bullet and shrapnel impacts. Bodies lay in the streets, German and American soldiers where they had fallen, covered with dust and flies. Madame Lefebvre walked through the ruins of her town and counted the cost of liberation in her neighbour's blood. The civilian experience of the Battle of Mortain illustrated the terrible randomness of war, visited upon people who had no control over their fate and no escape from danger. Mortain's pre-war population of 2,400 civilians had been reduced to perhaps 800 by August 6th, as families with means had evacuated south before fighting reached their town. Those who remained were mostly elderly, infirm, or too poor to leave. They sheltered in cellars, in church crypts, in any space that offered protection from artillery and bullets. Some cellars became tombs when buildings collapsed above them, burying families alive. Others became aid stations where French civilians treated wounded soldiers of both sides, using bedsheets for bandages and cognac for antiseptic. Marie Dubois, a schoolteacher, delivered a baby in a cellar by candlelight while artillery fire shook dust from the ceiling. Mother and child both survived, though the mother's husband had been killed 3 days earlier by a stray shell. The baby's first sounds were screaming mixed with explosions. It was not the welcome any parent would have chosen. American medics treating wounded soldiers in forward aid stations experienced a kind of factory-line butchery that no medical school could have prepared them for. Captain William Harris, a surgeon with the 30th Infantry Division, described his aid station during the peak of fighting. We had wounded men on every horizontal surface, tables, floors, benches, ground outside the tent. We triaged by walking through and tagging red for immediate surgery, yellow for delayed treatment, black for expectant. The black tags were the worst. Looking at a 19-year-old kid with abdominal wounds, knowing he's going to die in the next few hours, knowing we don't have the time or resources to save him, we gave them morphine and moved on to the ones we might save. I did 7 amputations in one day. Legs, arms. We just cut away, destroyed tissue, and tried to stop bleeding. No time for careful surgery, no time for proper technique. Cut, clamp, tie, move to next patient. I saved a lot of men. I also watched a lot of men die who should have lived. German soldiers, captured during the battle, experienced the strange inversion of becoming safe only after becoming prisoners. Obergefreiter Hans Müller, captured on August 9th when his position was overrun, described his surrender. We had no ammunition left, no food, no water. We had been fighting for 4 days with perhaps 6 hours total sleep. When the Americans came, we just raised hands and waited. I thought they might shoot us. Instead, they gave us water and cigarettes, searched us for weapons, and sent us to the rear. I walked past American supply dumps and saw more material than our entire division had. Mountains of ammunition boxes, rows of new vehicles, food in quantities I had not seen in years. I understood then why we were losing. We were brave, but they had everything. American military police processed thousands of German prisoners during the battle, overwhelming temporary POW cages, creating logistical problems that American abundance solved. German prisoners were fed from American supplies, more food than they had eaten in weeks. The experience of combat stress manifested differently across individuals, but destroyed men just as surely as bullets. Private James Thompson of the 35th Infantry Division had fought well for 5 days, performing his duties with competence and courage until something inside him broke. He could not identify what triggered the breakdown, no specific trauma, no single terrible moment, just accumulated stress until his mind refused to continue. Thompson described it. I was in my foxhole during artillery barrage, and suddenly I couldn't stop crying. Not fear exactly, not pain, just this overwhelming sadness and exhaustion. I tried to stop and couldn't. My squad leader found me sitting in my foxhole, weapon aside, just sobbing. He helped me to the aid station. The doctor gave me something to sleep. When I woke up, I was being evacuated rear. I felt ashamed. My friends were still fighting, and I had broken, but I couldn't go back. I just couldn't. Thompson spent 6 weeks in a psychiatric facility before being returned to duty in a rear area assignment. He survived the war but never forgave himself for what he saw as cowardice. The French civilians who remained in combat zones became unwilling witnesses to horrors they could not forget and could not adequately describe. Young Pierre Moreau, 15 years old, watched from a cellar window as American and German soldiers fought in his street. He saw men die 3 meters from his hiding place, saw wounded men crawl, seeking shelter that did not exist, saw bodies left where they fell because neither side could risk exposing themselves to recover dead comrades. Pierre kept a diary during the battle, childish handwriting recording adult horrors. August 9th, 2 soldiers died in front of our house today. One was screaming for his mother. The screaming stopped. August 10th, no food left. We are eating raw potatoes from the cellar. Artillery never stops. August 11th, Monsieur Renard's house collapsed. Don't know if he got out. August 12th, the Americans came and said we could leave. We climbed over rubble. Everything is destroyed. I don't know where we will live. Medical personnel on both sides faced ethical dilemmas that peacetime medicine never addressed. Should you treat the seriously wounded soldier who will survive but require hours of surgery, or treat 5 soldiers with lesser wounds who will return to combat? Should you give your last morphine dose to the dying man to ease his suffering, or save it for the wounded man who might survive but will need it for painful treatment? Should you evacuate the wounded officer or the wounded private when you have capacity for only one? American military medicine generally prioritized treating soldiers who could return to duty quickly, accepting that some seriously wounded men would die for lack of treatment that might have saved them. German military medicine, operating under more severe resource constraints, made even harsher choices. The calculus was brutal but unavoidable. Individual lives mattered less than military effectiveness, and medical resources were allocated to maximize fighting strength, not to minimize suffering. The psychological adaptation to continuous combat that allowed soldiers to function also created emotional numbness that troubled those who experienced it. Soldiers reported that after days of fighting, death became routine, comrades' deaths tragic but not paralyzing. Sergeant Michael O'Brien of the 30th Division described the change. After you see enough men die, something shuts off inside. You stop thinking of them as people and start thinking of them as casualties. You have to, or you couldn't keep going. When Jackson got hit, my first thought wasn't, my friend is wounded, but we need a replacement rifleman. I helped bandage him, got him evacuated, and kept fighting. I felt bad about it later. In the moment, I just didn't feel much of anything. Maybe that makes me a bad person, or maybe that's what you become to survive. The emotional cost of combat extended long past the battle itself, manifesting in decades of nightmares, guilt, depression, and damaged relationships that no medal could heal. Civilians emerged from cellars when the fighting ended to discover that liberation had cost them everything they owned. Homes were destroyed, businesses were ruined, livestock had been killed by shellfire or slaughtered for food by soldiers. Fields were cratered and sown with unexploded ordnance that would kill farmers for years after. The price of freedom, Madame Lefebvre thought bitterly, had been everything she had spent her life building. The Americans were generous with food and medical care. The French provisional government promised reconstruction assistance, but promises could not resurrect the dead, could not rebuild a medieval town destroyed in a week, could not restore the life that had existed before the Battle of Mortain consumed it. When journalists asked Madame Lefebvre if she was grateful for liberation, she answered honestly, I am grateful to be alive. I am grateful the Germans are gone. But grateful is a complicated word when you are standing in the ruins of everything you knew. Colonel Hammond Burks stood in the operations tent of Combat Command B, 3rd Armoured Division, on the morning of August 11th, 1944, studying a map that showed Hill 314 as a small circle surrounded by red hatching, indicating enemy positions. For 5 days, 700 American soldiers had been isolated on that hill, surrounded, running out of supplies, still fighting. Radio contact was intermittent, battery power failing, But the messages that got through painted a desperate picture. Ammunition critical, water exhausted, medical supplies gone, casualties exceeding 300. Yet somehow, impossibly, the position still held. Bradley himself had called that morning, with orders phrased as request. Get those men off that hill, whatever it takes. They've earned relief. Burks looked at his staff officers and began planning an operation that would require fighting through 4 miles of German-held territory against an enemy that had spent 5 days fortifying positions specifically to prevent exactly this relief. Attempts. The relief force assembled during the afternoon of August 11th represented a combined arms task force built for a single mission, breakthrough. The corps would be Company C, 32nd Armoured Regiment, 18 M4 Sherman tanks mounting 75mm guns. Supporting them would be infantry from the 119th Infantry Regiment, 30th Division, soldiers who knew the terrain and had fought over every yard of ground between American lines and Hill 314. Combat engineers would lead the column, clearing obstacles and marking paths through minefields. Tank destroyers would provide overwatch, their 90mm guns engaging any German armour that appeared. Artillery observers would coordinate fire support from every available battery in the division. The plan was simple in concept and brutal in execution. Advance directly toward Hill 314 along the most direct route, punch through German positions by concentrated violence, reach the hill before German forces could organise effective counterattack. The advance began at 0600 hours on August 12th, Sherman tanks rolling forward in column with infantry riding on their hulls, a technique that violated doctrine but saved time and kept infantry fresh for fighting. The first German positions appeared within minutes, machine gun nests in hedgerows flanking the road. American tanks fired high explosive and white phosphorus rounds into the hedgerows, setting vegetation ablaze, forcing German defenders to abandon positions or burn. Infantry dismounted under fire, assaulted forward through smoke and flame, cleared positions with grenades and rifle fire. The column advanced 200 yards in the first hour, fast by Normandy standards, but agonizingly slow for men who knew the surrounded battalion was running out of time. German resistance stiffened as the relief force approached l'Abbaye Blanche, a hamlet that had changed hands 3 times in the past week and where German forces had established strong defensive positions. The fight for l'Abbaye Blanche consumed 2 hours and cost the relief force 18 killed and 40 wounded, casualties measured against progress measured in yards. German infantry, fighting from stone buildings and prepared positions, stopped the initial American assault with accurate rifle and machine gun fire. American tanks, confined to narrow streets, were vulnerable to German Panzerfaust rockets fired from upper-story windows. The first Sherman hit brewed up immediately, ammunition exploding, blocking the street and forcing following tanks to maneuver through gardens and over walls. American infantry cleared buildings room by room, grenade first, then rifle fire, sometimes hand-to-hand combat in dark cellars. A German counterattack by 20 SS Panzer Grenadiers nearly cut off the lead American company before artillery fire broke up the attack. By 0830 hours, l'Abbaye Blanche was secured, but the cost had been high and the objective was still 3 miles distant. German forces defending the approaches to Hill 314 fought with the desperation of men who understood that allowing relief through would mean their 5-day siege had accomplished nothing. Elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, which had invested so much effort and so many casualties trying to capture the hill, were not willing to simply allow the Americans to walk away. German commanders committed their last operational tanks, 9 Panthers and 7 Panzer Mark IVs, to blocking positions across the relief forces' line of advance. American tank destroyers, moving with the column specifically to deal with German armour, engaged at maximum range with their powerful 90mm guns. The engagement was brief and decisive. 2 Panthers were destroyed immediately. A third was disabled. The surviving German tanks pulled back, crews understanding that trading shots with American 90mm guns was suicidal. But the delay cost the relief force another 45 minutes and 3 more wounded men. On Hill 314, Major Maurice Herlong listened to radio reports of the relief force fighting toward his position and tried to calculate whether his battalion could hold long enough for relief to arrive. The 6th day of siege had reduced his effective strength to approximately 400 men capable of fighting. Ammunition was down to final magazines. Water was completely exhausted, men licking dew from grass to wet their mouths. Medical supplies were non-existent. Wounded men lying in agony without morphine, without bandages, without anything except the presence of medics who could do nothing but watch them suffer. German attacks had tapered off during the past 24 hours, suggesting either that the Germans were withdrawing or that they were preparing something bigger. Herlong had no way to know which. He passed word to company commanders. Relief force is fighting toward us. We hold until they arrive. No withdrawal. No surrender. We hold. The message passed through foxholes and fighting positions with the weight of religious commandment. Hold. The word meant everything. It was purpose and mission and identity. They had held for 5 days. They would hold for the 6th. The final mile of the relief approach, from the base of Hill 314's slopes to the summit, required American forces to advance uphill under observation and fire from German positions that had been fortified for days. Sherman tanks could not climb the steep slopes, forcing infantry to assault on foot with only direct fire support from tank guns below. Company A, 119th Infantry, fixed bayonets and climbed, moving in small groups from cover to cover, suppressed by friendly artillery fire that walked just ahead of their advance. German defenders, weakened by 5 days of combat and knowing the battle was lost, offered sporadic resistance, then withdrew. Some Germans surrendered, some simply fled. A few fought to the end, machine gunners firing until American grenades silenced them. The climb that should have taken 30 minutes under combat conditions stretched to 90 minutes of exhausted men hauling themselves up rocky slopes, firing at shadows, expecting counterattack that never came. At 16:30 hours on August 12, 1944, the lead elements of Company A, 119th Infantry, reached the summit of Hill 314. American soldiers who had been surrounded for 6 days watched their rescuers crest the ridge and could not quite believe relief had actually arrived. Some men wept, some cheered weakly, voices hoarse from dehydration. Most simply stood in their foxholes and stared, exhausted beyond emotion, too tired to celebrate survival. Major Herlong met Captain Robert Dixon, commanding the Relief Force Infantry, and reported with the formal precision of a man hanging on to self-control by will alone. 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry, reporting effective strength, 400 men. Casualties, 300. Position held as ordered. Dixon, looking at the hollow-eyed scarecrows who had held the hill for 6 days, managed only, "Good work, Major. Let's get your wounded evacuated." The evacuation of wounded from Hill 314 required hours of careful work by medics and stretcher-bearers who climbed the hill in darkness to avoid German artillery fire. 300 wounded men, some barely clinging to life, had to be carried down steep slopes on stretchers, loaded into ambulances, and transported to field hospitals. The most seriously wounded went first, men who would die without immediate surgery. Then came the walking wounded, men who could move under their own power but needed medical attention. Finally came the dead, 57 men killed during the siege, their bodies carried down wrapped in shelter halves for burial in temporary graves. American military protocol specified that dead soldiers would be recovered and buried with honours whenever possible. The men who carried those bodies down Hill 314 in darkness, stumbling over rocks, muscles burning from exertion, understood they were performing a sacred duty. These men had died holding ground that everyone agreed was not particularly important, but they had held it, and that made it sacred. The survivors of 2nd Battalion who could still walk were led down the hill during the early hours of August 13th, moving in single file through darkness toward American lines. They carried their weapons and nothing else, leaving behind equipment, personal possessions, everything except what they could carry. The descent was surreal. Men who had spent 6 days surrounded by enemies now walking through positions where Germans had been hours before, seeing abandoned German equipment, German dead, evidence of the siege from the other perspective. They reached American lines as dawn broke, were fed hot food and coffee, the first hot meal in a week, and many men vomited immediately, their stomachs unable to handle food after days of starvation rations. Medical personnel checked every man for wounds, dehydration, signs of combat fatigue. More than half required medical treatment, all required rest. The battalion was pulled off the line and sent to rear areas for reconstitution. They had held Hill 314, the price had been paid. Whether the price had been worth paying was a question for historians and generals. The soldiers had simply done what they were told. The German perspective on the Hill 314 siege revealed a different kind of failure, more corrosive because it served no purpose. SS Hauptsturmführer Karl Fischer, who had commanded one of the assault forces attempting to capture the hill, wrote in his after-action report, We committed 2 infantry battalions and supporting armour to reducing this position over 6 days. We achieved nothing except our own casualties, exceeding 400 men. The Americans held because they had superior artillery support, because they had air resupply, because they were fighting from good defensive terrain. We attacked because we were ordered to, not because capturing the position served any operational purpose. The hill became symbolic rather than tactical. We fought for it because we had been fighting for it. Circular logic that cost lives for no gain. This is not how professional armies should operate. Fisher's report was noted and filed without action. The siege had failed. The relief had succeeded. Hill 314 had held, and the Battle of Mortain was entering its final phase. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge travelled to the front lines near Mortain on August 12, 1944, against the advice of his staff and the preferences of his security detail. He needed to see for himself what ultra-intercepts and situation reports could only describe in abstract terms. He needed to understand whether the situation was as catastrophic as he believed or whether some possibility of salvation remained. The drive took longer than expected, his convoy forced to detour repeatedly around destroyed bridges and cratered roads, halting frequently to avoid Allied fighter bombers that patrolled French skies like predatory birds. When von Kluge finally reached divisional headquarters of the 2nd Panzer Division, what he saw confirmed his worst assessments. Tank parks that should have held companies of armour contained only handfuls of operational vehicles. Infantry battalions that should have mustered 600 men could barely field 200. Supply dumps were nearly empty. The soldiers looked exhausted, filthy, hollow-eyed. Von Kluge was a professional officer who had seen defeat before in Russia, but this was different. This was an army that had fought beyond its strength and lost not just a battle but its capacity to continue fighting. The situation briefing von Kluge received from division commanders at the front was unsparing in its honesty. The Mortain offensive had failed completely. Territorial gains were trivial and would probably be lost within days. German casualties exceeded 6,000 men and 140 tanks. American forces were counterattacking along the entire front. British and Canadian forces were pushing south from Caen toward Falaise. American forces were reported moving north from Le Mans toward Argentan. The implications were obvious, even if no one wanted to state them explicitly. German forces in Normandy were being encircled. The window for organised withdrawal was perhaps 48 hours. After that, withdrawal would become breakout, fighting through encirclement, leaving behind all heavy equipment, accepting catastrophic casualties. Von Kluge asked the question every commander dreaded: what are our options? The division commander's answer was brutally simple: withdrawal now, while routes remain open, or destruction later when the trap closes. Von Kluge nodded slowly and said nothing. He could not authorize withdrawal without Hitler's permission. And Hitler would not grant permission because Hitler did not accept that withdrawal was necessary. The radio silence that occurred on August 13th, 1944, transformed von Kluge's inspection tour into a crisis that nearly cost him his command and possibly his life. Von Kluge's command vehicle travelling between divisional headquarters was hit by Allied air attack around 1300 hours. The vehicle was damaged but not destroyed. Von Kluge and his staff were unhurt but forced to abandon the vehicle and take cover. More critically, the vehicle's radio equipment was destroyed, cutting von Kluge off from contact with his headquarters. For 8 hours, Army Group B's commander was out of communication, his location unknown, his status unclear. At Hitler's headquarters in Rastenburg, the silence provoked immediate suspicion. Where was von Kluge? Why had he gone to the front without proper security? Was he negotiating with the Allies? Had he defected? Hitler's paranoia, always substantial, reached fever pitch. He ordered the Gestapo to investigate. He demanded explanations. He prepared orders to relieve von Kluge of command. When radio contact was finally restored at 2100 hours and von Kluge reported that he had simply been caught in an air attack, Hitler's suspicions were not satisfied. Too convenient, too suspicious, too much like treason. Von Kluge's connection to the July 20th assassination plot against Hitler had been ambiguous and therefore damning. He had known that some of his subordinates were involved in the conspiracy. He had not reported them. He had not participated actively, but had not rejected overtures completely. After the plot failed and Hitler survived, hundreds of officers were arrested, interrogated, executed, Von Kluge had escaped arrest only because his guilt could not be definitely proven, and because Hitler needed experienced commanders for the deteriorating situation in France. But Hitler trusted him not at all, suspected him of defeatism, if not outright treason, watched for any excuse to remove him. The 8-hour radio silence on August 13th provided that excuse. On August 15th, von Kluge received a message from Rastenburg. He was relieved of command immediately, to be replaced by Field Marshal Walter Model. He was to return to Germany to report on the situation in France. The message was phrased politely, but everyone understood the subtext. Von Kluge was being recalled to face investigation, possible court-martial, likely execution. Field Marshal Walter Model arrived in France on August 16th to assume command of a disaster in progress. Model was Hitler's favourite crisis manager, a hard-driving officer who specialised in conducting defensive battles and stabilising collapsing fronts. He had performed miracles on the Eastern Front, stopping Soviet offensives that should have succeeded, extracting German forces from encirclements that should have destroyed them. Hitler trusted Model, absolutely believed Model could salvage any situation through will and aggression. Model took one look at the situation in Normandy and understood immediately that even he could not reverse what was happening. The Falaise gap was closing, German forces were trapped. The only question was whether any could be extracted before the trap snapped shut completely. Model issued orders authorizing withdrawal, something von Kluge had been unable to do. But the authorization came too late. German forces that should have been retreating 3 days earlier were now fighting for survival in an ever-shrinking pocket. Von Kluge's final journey began on August 18th, 1944, as he travelled from France toward Germany under orders to report to Hitler. He travelled in a staff car with a small security detail, following roads choked with retreating German forces, passing through towns destroyed by Allied bombing, seeing everywhere evidence of German defeat. Near Verdun, site of the great First World War battle where German and French armies had bled each other white in 1916, von Kluge ordered his driver to stop. He dismissed his security detail, telling them he needed a few moments alone. He walked to the edge of the old battlefield, where craters and trenches from that earlier war were still visible in the landscape. He stood there for perhaps 20 minutes, looking across ground where hundreds of thousands had died in a war that had solved nothing and led directly to this second, even more terrible war. Then he returned to his staff car, sat in the back seat, and swallowed a cyanide capsule. The letter von Kluge left for Hitler, found on his body by the security detail, was a masterpiece of professional pride, personal despair, and subtle accusation. 6 pages, handwritten, it defended von Kluge's conduct in France, insisted he had always done his duty, documented the impossible conditions under which German forces had fought. It praised Hitler's vision and genius in terms that might have been sincere or might have been bitterly ironic. It concluded with a plea that Hitler end the war, negotiate peace, spare Germany further destruction. I have always admired your greatness, my Führer, your willingness to carry through this struggle without compromise, but the time has come to face reality. Germany cannot win this war. The Western Allies will not negotiate while they are winning. Every day we continue fighting brings us closer to complete destruction. I urge you to end this war while something of Germany remains to save. As for me, I am now ending a life that has lost all meaning. I can no longer serve effectively. I cannot face what awaits me in Germany. I choose to die here, on the battlefield where my army died. The letter was collected by the SS, delivered to Hitler, read once, and filed. Hitler's only comment was reported as, "traitor to the end." The death of von Kluge illustrated the impossible position of German commanders in the final year of the war, ordered to accomplish missions that could not be accomplished, blamed for failures that were inevitable, suspected of treason if they reported honestly, executed if they refused orders. Von Kluge had been a capable officer, not brilliant but competent, trying to serve his country in an impossible situation. The Mortain offensive had been doomed from the start, not because von Kluge planned poorly, but because Hitler's strategic vision had no connection to reality. No German commander could have succeeded at Mortain given the forces available, the Allied advantages, and the fundamental strategic situation. Von Kluge's failure was not professional but political. He could not find a way to tell Hitler the truth without being destroyed for telling it. So he followed orders he knew were disastrous, watched men die implementing plans he knew would fail, and ultimately chose death over the humiliation of court-martial and execution for defeatism. His fate would be shared by other German officers in the months ahead, caught between duty and reality, unable to reconcile professional competence with political insanity. The reaction to von Kluge's suicide at higher German command levels revealed the moral bankruptcy of the regime he had served. Some officers mourned a colleague driven to desperation. Others whispered that he had been weak, that a stronger officer would have found a way to succeed. Still others suggested he had been guilty after all, that suicide proved his involvement in treason. Hitler himself showed no emotion at the news, moving immediately to discussing operations under Model's command. Von Kluge was erased from official histories during the remaining months of the Reich, his name not mentioned, his service not acknowledged. Only after the war, when surviving German officers wrote their memoirs and historians reconstructed events, did von Kluge's story emerge. A professional soldier destroyed by serving an amateur strategist who valued loyalty over competence, belief over reality, fantasy over truth. Mortain had killed thousands of soldiers in direct combat. It had also killed at least one field marshal through a different but equally devastating mechanism. The battle's casualties included not just men who died on the battlefield, but men who died because the battlefield taught them truths their leaders would not accept. The Polish 1st Armoured Division and the American 90th Infantry Division met at the village of Chambois on August 19, 1944, linking their positions and closing the Falaise gap completely. The link-up was not dramatic, no grand ceremony, just exhausted soldiers from different armies confirming they had reached their objective and that German forces to the west were now encircled. Polish tank crews, who had fought their way south from Falaise against desperate German resistance, shook hands with American infantry who had fought north from Argentan. Staff officers compared maps and established unit boundaries. Artillery observers coordinated fire plans to prevent friendly fire incidents, and then they turned their guns toward the pocket to the west and began the systematic destruction of everything trapped inside. The Battle of Mortain, which had begun 13 days earlier as German offensive toward Avranches, was about to end as German catastrophe at Falaise. The Falaise pocket, at maximum extent, before it began to shrink, measured roughly 40 miles long by 15 miles wide and contained approximately 100,000 German soldiers from parts of 20 divisions. Inside that pocket were the survivors of the Mortain offensive, the panzer divisions that had attacked west and been stopped, the infantry divisions that had held positions while tanks advanced, the artillery batteries and supply columns and headquarters units that supported combat operations. Also inside were the wounded in field hospitals, the maintenance units trying to repair damaged vehicles, the supply personnel distributing what little food and ammunition remained. The pocket was not organised territory under German control. It was chaos. Units mixed together, chains of command broken, everyone moving east, trying to reach the gap before it closed. Allied forces surrounding the pocket did not need to attack into it. They simply needed to prevent breakout and destroy everything that could not escape. The escape route through Falaise Gap, in the final days before it closed completely, was 5 miles wide and under constant fire from 3 directions. Allied artillery, positioned on the high ground north and south of the gap, had pre-registered every crossroads, every bridge, every piece of terrain that German forces would need to cross during withdrawal. When German columns appeared, trying to escape east, American and British artillery fired time-on-target missions that brought shells from dozens of batteries down simultaneously. German vehicles exploded. German soldiers died by hundreds, by thousands. Those who survived the artillery ran into Allied fighter bombers that circled overhead in relays, always at least a dozen aircraft present, diving on any vehicles that moved. The Typhoons and Thunderbolts that had dominated the Mortain battlefield now concentrated at Falaise with even more devastating effect. Pilots reported targets so numerous they could not engage them all, running out of ammunition and rockets before running out of targets. The corridor of death, as soldiers of both sides named it, defied description in its horror. A German lieutenant who escaped through the gap on August 18th described the experience. The road was choked with vehicles, all trying to move east, all under fire simultaneously. Artillery shells were falling like rain, aircraft were diving constantly, vehicles burned, horses screamed, men ran in all directions. I abandoned my truck and moved on foot, stepping over dead bodies, past burning tanks, through scenes from hell itself. The road surface was slick with blood. You could not walk without stepping on remains of men and animals. The smell was overwhelming, burning flesh and explosives and death. I saw an entire artillery battery destroyed in place. Every gun burning, every gunner dead. I saw horses that had been harnessed to wagons, dead in their traces, the wagons overturned and burning behind them. I saw soldiers who had gone insane, just standing in the road laughing or crying, ignoring the shells and bullets. It took me 6 hours to cover 5 miles. Of the 40 men who started with me, 7 made it through. German forces attempting to fight their way out of the pocket demonstrated the courage that had made the Wehrmacht formidable, even in defeat serving a cause that was lost. The 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich and 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend formed the rearguard, fighting defensive actions that allowed other units to escape. These SS divisions, depleted to fractions of their original strength, held positions at Trun-en-Chambois against Allied attacks for critical hours, buying time with their blood. The 12th SS, a division that had started the Normandy campaign with over 20,000 men, was reduced to approximately 300 combat-effective soldiers and 10 operational tanks by August 19th. They held for 36 hours, then attempted to break out. Approximately 600 men from the division survived the war. The rest died at Falaise or in earlier fighting, young men from the Hitler Youth who had been taught they were invincible and learned at terrible cost that belief could not stop bullets. The material losses suffered by German forces in the Falaise pocket exceeded any single battle on the Western Front before or after. Allied intelligence officers, surveying the pocket after resistance ceased, counted approximately 500 destroyed or abandoned tanks, 1,500 destroyed or abandoned artillery pieces, and more than 10,000 destroyed or abandoned vehicles of all types. The counts were conservative, probably underestimating actual losses because vehicles had been destroyed so completely that counting them separately was impossible. Aerial photographs showed roads lined with wreckage stretching for miles. Fields were littered with equipment. Every village held destroyed vehicles. Every crossroads was blocked by burned-out tanks. The material strength that Germany had assembled in France over 4 years, the tanks and guns and trucks that represented irreplaceable production, was gone. Lost, not in months of gradual attrition, but in 1 week of encirclement and destruction. The human cost was even more staggering. German casualties in the Falaise pocket, including the approach battles at Mortain, exceeded 60,000 men killed, wounded, or captured during August 6th through 21st. Approximately 10,000 German soldiers died in the pocket itself, killed by artillery fire, air attacks, or in desperate attempts to break through Allied lines. 50,000 were captured, overwhelming Allied prisoner of war facilities, creating logistical nightmares as tens of thousands of prisoners needed to be fed, guarded, transported. Only about 20 to 40,000 Germans escaped through the gap before it closed, mostly infantry who abandoned their equipment and infiltrated through Allied lines at night. They escaped with their lives, but without weapons, without transportation, without unit cohesion. They were defeated soldiers, not a functioning army. The German capacity to defend France had been destroyed in 2 weeks at Mortain and Falaise. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander Allied Expeditionary Force, visited the closed Falaise pocket on August 21st and later wrote about what he saw. The battlefield at Falaise was unquestionably one of the greatest killing fields of any of the war areas. Roads, highways, and fields were so choked with destroyed equipment and with dead men and animals that passage through the area was extremely difficult. 48 hours after the closing of the gap, I was conducted through it on foot to encounter scenes that could be described only by Dante. It was literally possible to walk for hundreds of yards at a time, stepping on nothing but dead and decaying flesh. Eisenhower's description, from a general who had seen multiple battlefields across 2 world wars, testified to the unique horror of Falaise. This was not ordinary combat destruction. This was systematic annihilation of an army caught in a trap from which there was no escape. The strategic consequences of Falaise were immediate and decisive. The German army in France, which had numbered nearly 60 divisions on D-Day, had been reduced to scattered remnants incapable of sustained resistance. Paris was liberated on August 25th, 4 days after Falaise closed, German garrison withdrawing without serious fight. Allied forces crossed the Seine River by August 30th. By early September, Allied armies were approaching the German border, having advanced from Normandy to the Siegfried Line in 4 weeks. The victory that had seemed impossible in June, that had ground slowly through July, that had exploded in August, was nearly complete. Germany had lost France, lost an army, lost any chance of holding the Allies at the Atlantic Wall or the Seine River or anywhere except on German soil itself. The road to Berlin was open, the end of the war in Europe was now a matter of time and casualties, not of outcome. The Battle of Mortain, viewed from the perspective of Falaise, revealed itself as the hinge on which German defeat had turned. Hitler's decision to attack west instead of retreating east had held German forces in place exactly when and where Allied encirclement could destroy them. The offensive that was supposed to split the Allied armies and throw them back to the sea had instead destroyed German capacity to defend France. Von Kluge and his successors had protested Hitler's orders, had recognized the danger, had warned of disaster. Hitler had insisted on continuing the offensive, had ordered additional forces committed, had refused to authorize withdrawal until too late. The result was the most complete tactical defeat German arms suffered in the West during the entire war. Mortain had been the offensive, Falaise was the consequence, and together they demonstrated that in modern warfare, strategic delusion could kill armies faster than enemy action. The after-action reports that filtered up through American command channels in late August 1944 painted a picture of combat that validated some doctrines, challenged others, and revealed advantages that statistics alone could not capture. The American tank destroyer doctrine, controversial before Mortain, emerged vindicated by battlefield results. Tank destroyer battalions equipped with M10 Wolverines and M36 Jacksons had accounted for more than 80 German tanks destroyed during the battle, achieving kill ratios approaching 4-1 despite fighting vehicles with heavier armor and more powerful guns. The key had been mobility and ambush tactics. Allow German tanks to advance into killing zones, engage from flanks and rear at ranges where American guns could penetrate, then displace before German return. Fire could be effective. American losses of tank destroyers had been minimal, fewer than 20 vehicles destroyed or disabled. The doctrine worked, but only because American crews had the discipline to wait for perfect shots rather than engaging impulsively. Artillery proved to be the dominant weapon system at Mortain, more important than tanks, more deadly than aircraft, more decisive than any other factor. American artillery fired more than 250,000 rounds during the battle, a rate of expenditure that would have bankrupted any army without America's industrial capacity. The centralized fire control system that allowed any forward observer to call fire from multiple battalions simultaneously gave American forces overwhelming advantage in responsive firepower. German commanders consistently reported in after-action assessments that American artillery was the most significant problem they faced, more than air attacks, more than armor, more than anything else. The psychological effect of American time-on-target missions, where dozens of batteries fired simultaneously to bring shells down on target at the same instant, was particularly devastating. German soldiers who survived TOT missions described them as more terrifying than anything they had experienced in Russia. The intelligence advantage provided by ultra-code breaking proved decisive at strategic level, even if tactical commanders never knew it existed. Allied commanders knew German plans, German strength, German intentions, because British codebreakers at Bletchley Park were reading German high command communications almost in real time. Bradley knew the Mortain offensive was coming before German field commanders received their orders. Montgomery knew German dispositions around Falaise and could plan his attacks to hit weak points. Eisenhower knew Hitler was refusing to authorize withdrawal and could time the closing of the encirclement to trap maximum German forces. The Germans were fighting blind against an enemy who could see their every move. Post-war German commanders, learning about Ultra, uniformly stated that had they known their communications were compromised, they would have changed procedures, used different codes, operated differently, but they did not know, and the ignorance cost them battles and eventually the war. Allied air superiority transformed from advantage to dominance at Mortain in ways that permanently changed German tactical doctrine. The Luftwaffe's absence from the battlefield, complete and total, meant that Allied aircraft operated without fear of interception. RAF Typhoons and USAF P-47s flew more than 4,000 sorties during the 2 weeks of battle, attacking targets with impunity, adjusting tactics based on lessons learned each day, developing the close air support procedures that would dominate future conflicts. The actual kill rates achieved by air attacks were less impressive than the sorties suggested. Post-battle analysis showed that perhaps 240 German tanks were destroyed or damaged by air attack. hit rates below 5%, but the psychological and operational effects were overwhelming. German forces could not move during daylight, could not concentrate, could not mass for attacks. The doctrine of blitzkrieg warfare that had made Germany formidable required speed and concentration. Air supremacy made both impossible. The performance of individual weapon systems yielded surprising conclusions that influenced procurement and tactical development for the remainder of the war. The American M4 Sherman tank, criticized by soldiers as undergunned and underarmored compared to German Panthers and Tigers, proved adequate when used properly. American commanders learned not to engage German tanks directly in slugfests where German advantages in armor and gunpowder would dominate. Instead, Shermans maneuvered for flank shots, used mobility to avoid German fire, relied on superior numbers and better logistics. German tanks were individually superior. American tank production was overwhelming. American tank crews could afford to take losses that would have crippled German formations. The arithmetic was harsh but effective. Losing 3 Shermans to kill 1 Panther was acceptable when Sherman production replaced losses in weeks, while German production took months. The German Panzerfaust, a single-shot anti-tank rocket launcher that cost almost nothing to produce, proved remarkably effective against Allied armor and influenced anti-tank weapon development for decades after. American tankers learned to fear infantry armed with Panzerfausts in close terrain, where a single soldier hiding in rubble could destroy a 50-ton tank with a weapon costing less than a soldier's monthly pay. The weapon was crude, inaccurate beyond 100 meters, dangerous to the user, but it gave German infantry a way to fight tanks that did not require expensive anti-tank guns or scarce ammunition. Post-war American military development, studying German weapons captured at Mortain and elsewhere, led directly to the American bazooka improvements and eventually to modern anti-tank guided missiles. Some of the most important military technology developments emerged not from research laboratories but from battlefield innovations driven by desperation. Medical lessons from Mortain influenced combat casualty care for decades, establishing principles of rapid evacuation and forward surgery that saved countless lives. The American system of battalion aid stations, clearing stations, field hospitals, and rear area evacuation hospitals processed thousands of wounded, with survival rates unprecedented in military history. Wounded American soldiers who reached aid stations alive had better than 90% chance of survival compared to 50% or worse in previous wars. The keys were speed of evacuation, availability of blood plasma, and presence of skilled surgeons at field hospitals close to front lines. German medical care was equally skilled but hampered by inability to evacuate wounded during daylight due to Allied air attacks. German wounded often waited 12 to 24 hours for evacuation, during which infections developed and survival chances dropped. The lesson was clear. Medical skill mattered less than medical access, and access required logistics and air superiority. The psychological and leadership lessons from Mortain were harder to quantify but equally important. American small unit leadership, with emphasis on initiative and adaptability, proved effective in confused battle conditions where communications were disrupted and plans obsolete. American sergeants and lieutenants, given mission-type orders and trusted to accomplish them however possible, improvised solutions that rigid doctrine could never have prescribed. German tactical excellence, still formidable at Mortain, could not overcome strategic incompetence at higher levels. German soldiers fought bravely and skillfully, but fighting for unattainable objectives ordered by commanders out of touch with reality meant courage was wasted and skill was insufficient. The question Mortain posed, but could not answer, was whether any amount of tactical excellence could overcome strategic stupidity. The battle suggested the answer was no. The combined arms coordination demonstrated by American forces at Mortain, infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, and air power working together in real time, represented doctrinal maturity that had been paid for in blood through 2 years of combat in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. American forces in 1944 fought with confidence and competence that American forces in 1942 had lacked. Lessons learned in earlier defeats had been absorbed, incorporated into doctrine, trained until they became instinctive. The learning curve had been steep and bloody, but by Mortain, American forces had learned how to fight, how to coordinate complex operations, how to leverage material advantages through tactical competence. The learning process continued through the remainder of the war, but Mortain marked the point where American military performance reached rough parity with German tactical excellence, while maintaining overwhelming material superiority. After Mortain, German forces were fighting an enemy that matched them in skill and overwhelmed them in resources. The combination was unsustainable. The strategic map of Western Europe on August 5, 1944, showed Allied forces in a position of extraordinary vulnerability, disguised as triumph. More than 400,000 American soldiers and their equipment were flowing through a single choke point at Avranches, a bottleneck just 6 miles wide, where the Norman coast bent south toward Brittany. Every tank, every truck, every artillery piece, every gallon of fuel supporting Patton's Third Army had to pass through this narrow corridor. One major bridge carried half the traffic, a handful of roads carried the rest. If the Germans had succeeded in cutting this artery, if Operation Lüttich had achieved its objective of reaching the coast at Avranches, the entire Allied exploitation would have collapsed instantly. 400,000 men would have been isolated, surrounded, forced to fight their way back to Allied lines or surrender. The comparison to Dunkirk was obvious and terrifying. Mortain's failure was not just a lost battle for Germany. It was the prevention of a catastrophe for the Allies. The logistical dependence on Avranches was absolute and acknowledged by Allied commanders as their greatest vulnerability. Through Avranches flowed 20,000 tons of supplies daily, everything from ammunition to food to fuel to spare parts. Patton's armoured divisions, racing across France, consumed fuel at rates that shocked logistics officers. Some divisions burned 50,000 gallons of gasoline per day, more than small cities consumed in peacetime. All of that fuel came through Avranches. If the Germans had cut the supply line even temporarily, Patton's tanks would have stopped in place, out of gas, vulnerable to counterattack. Bradley's memoirs, published years after the war, admitted candidly, if the Germans had reached Avranches and held for even 48 hours, we would have faced the most serious crisis of the entire campaign. Patton's army would have been immobilized. Our exploitation would have stalled. The Germans might have stabilized a new defensive line that would have added months to the war. Bradley's assessment was not hypothetical. It was analysis based on logistics data showing exactly how quickly Allied forces would have been paralyzed without Avranches. The political consequences of a successful German counteroffensive at Mortain would have extended far beyond military operations, potentially affecting the entire Allied coalition. British forces, already exhausted and running short of manpower, had opposed the broad front strategy that concentrated American forces in Brittany. Montgomery had argued for a narrow thrust into Germany concentrated in the north. American disaster at Mortain would have vindicated British caution, strengthened Montgomery's argument for British command of ground forces, and potentially altered the entire strategic approach to defeating Germany. Worse, German success at Mortain in August 1944 might have given Hitler's regime breathing space to deploy new weapons that were in development. The V-2 rocket, the Me-2 jet fighter, improved U-boats. None of these weapons could have changed the war's ultimate outcome given Allied material superiority and Soviet pressure from the east. But they could have prolonged the war, increased casualties, and altered the post-war settlement in unpredictable ways. The comparison to successful German counteroffensives elsewhere demonstrated what might have happened if Mortain had succeeded. At Kasserine Pass in Tunisia in February 1943, German forces under Rommel had smashed into American positions and inflicted humiliating defeat, teaching American forces painful lessons about German tactical competence. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 showed what German armoured forces could still accomplish when they achieved surprise and concentration. Breakthrough, panic, temporary reversal of Allied plans. Mortain, if successful, would have fallen between these examples in effect. Not as amateurish as Kasserine, not as desperate as the Bulge, but potentially devastating if German forces had reached their objective. The key difference was that Mortain came at a moment when cutting Allied supply lines could have strategic consequences, while Kasserine had been tactically embarrassing but strategically unimportant, and the Bulge came too late to change the war's trajectory. Hitler's strategic calculation in ordering the Mortain offensive, delusional though it proved, contained a kernel of logic that appeared more rational before the offensive failed. Hitler believed that a successful counteroffensive in France could crack the Anglo-American coalition, which he saw as unnatural alliance between capitalist democracies and communist Soviet Union. If Germany could demonstrate that Western allies were not invincible, if German forces could inflict a serious defeat, Hitler imagined that Britain and America might negotiate separate peace, allowing Germany to concentrate all forces against the Soviets. The reasoning was wishful thinking based on misunderstanding of Allied determination, but it was not entirely insane. Churchill and Roosevelt had significant political pressures from populations war-weary after 5 years of conflict. A major setback in France, especially one that looked like military incompetence, might have generated political crises in Washington and London. Hitler's error was not in recognizing that Allied unity had limits, but in overestimating German capacity to exploit those limits. The timeline of the war in Europe would have been significantly extended if Mortain had succeeded, adding months or potentially a year to the conflict. Allied forces did not cross the German border in strength until mid-September 1944, only 3 weeks after Mortain and Falaise. That rapid advance was possible because German forces in France had been destroyed and could not establish new defensive lines. If German forces had escaped destruction, if they had withdrawn in good order to prepared positions along the Seine River or the Siegfried Line, they could have imposed significant delays on Allied advance. Every month of delay meant more Allied casualties, more destruction in Germany, more suffering for civilians and prisoners. The moral arithmetic was brutal. Mortain's failure probably shortened the war by 6 months, which translates to hundreds of thousands of lives saved, soldiers and civilians, Allied and German. The battle that killed 10,000 in 2 weeks prevented deaths that would have numbered in hundreds of thousands. The technological and production factors that guaranteed Allied victory, regardless of Mortain's outcome, provided context for understanding why German desperation was strategic futility. Even if Germany had succeeded at Mortain, even if they had cut Allied supply lines temporarily, the fundamental imbalance in production capacity meant German victory was impossible. American industrial production in 1944 outstripped German production by factors of 4 or 5 in every major category. America produced more tanks in 1 month than Germany produced in 6. American aircraft production was so overwhelming that German Luftwaffe was outnumbered 10-1 by mid-1944. German forces could win tactical victories through skill and desperation, but they could not overcome the arithmetic of American factories and Soviet manpower. Mortain's importance was not that it prevented German victory that was already impossible, but that it accelerated inevitable defeat and reduced total casualties by shortening the war. The liberation of Paris on August 25, 1944, just 4 days after Falaise closed, symbolized how completely Mortain's failure had transformed the strategic situation. Paris, which had been under German occupation for 4 years, was freed without serious fighting because German forces lacked strength to hold it. The garrison withdrew rather than conducting house-to-house defense that would have destroyed the city. The liberation, celebrated around the world as triumph of democracy over fascism, would not have happened when it did if German forces had not been destroyed at Mortain and Falaise. If Mortain had succeeded, Paris might have remained under occupation for months longer, perhaps through winter of 1944-45. The suffering of Parisians, already severe after 4 years of occupation and Allied bombing, would have been prolonged. The symbolic importance of Paris liberation, the boost to Allied morale and French national pride, would have been delayed or altered. Mortain's failure made Paris liberation possible. The counterfactual question, what if Germany had succeeded at Mortain, ultimately demonstrated that some historical moments genuinely are hinges where events could have turned differently. Most battles, historians argue, do not actually change history's trajectory because underlying forces are too strong for single events to overcome. Germany was going to lose World War II regardless of Mortain because the material imbalance was too great. But the timing and manner of defeat, the casualties suffered, the political settlements reached, all could have been different. Mortain was a hinge moment not because it determined who would win the war, but because it determined how quickly victory would come and at what cost. The battle that failed to reach Avranches succeeded instead in accelerating German defeat, shortening the war, saving lives that statistics cannot count. The German soldiers who died attacking west toward objectives they could not reach, paid with their lives to teach a lesson their leaders refused to learn. Belief cannot overcome reality, will cannot replace resources, and desperation is not strategy. The monument on Hill 314 was dedicated on a bright August afternoon in 1947, 3 years after the battle that made the hill famous among soldiers and unknown to nearly everyone else. Veterans of 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry returned to Normandy for the ceremony. Grey-haired men in their 30s and 40s, who looked older than their years, wearing suits that did not quite fit anymore, standing on ground where they had faced death for 6 days. Major Maurice Herlong, now Lieutenant Colonel Herlong, gave a brief speech about courage and sacrifice and duty. He spoke about the 300 men who had become casualties on the hill, the 57 who had died there, the hundreds more who had been wounded. He did not mention his own role, did not describe the decisions he had made, did not claim credit for leadership that had kept his battalion together when disintegration seemed inevitable. The monument itself was simple, a granite stone with an inscription in French and English, listing the units that had fought there, the dates of the siege, the price that had been paid. At the top was carved simply, "They held." The post-war lives of Mortain survivors illustrated the complexity of carrying combat experience into peace. Some men returned home and resumed civilian lives with remarkable success, using discipline and leadership learned in war to build careers and families. Others struggled, haunted by memories, unable to forget what they had seen and done, suffering from what 1940s medicine called combat fatigue and what later generations would recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Lieutenant Ralph Curley, the artillery observer whose fire missions from Hill 314 had destroyed so many German vehicles, became a teacher in rural Kansas, never speaking about the war to his students, carrying his memories in private. Private James Thompson, who had broken under combat stress and been evacuated, worked in his father's hardware store, functional but damaged, drinking too much, waking from nightmares decades after the guns fell silent. The war ended in 1945, but for men who had fought at Mortain, some part of them remained on that hill, in those hedgerows, under fire that never completely stopped echoing. German survivors of Mortain faced even more complicated reintegration into societies that had been destroyed and occupied. SS Hauptsturmführer Karl Fischer, who had commanded assault forces against Hill 314, spent 4 years in Allied prisoner of war camps before being released in 1949 to a Germany divided and devastated. He found work as a labourer, his military experience worthless in a country that wanted to forget its military history. His memoirs, written in the 1960s and published in limited circulation, described the battle from German perspective with professional detachment, tactical assessments, descriptions of combat, analysis of what had gone wrong. What the memoirs did not discuss were the larger questions of guilt and responsibility, of serving a regime that had committed atrocities, of whether professional military competence was sufficient justification when fighting for an evil cause. Fischer died in 1978, taking his full story with him, leaving only the professional soldier's account of battles fought and lost. The historical treatment of Mortain revealed how battles are remembered selectively, preserved when they fit narratives of glory, and forgotten when they complicate simple stories. D-Day became the iconic battle of the Normandy campaign, celebrated in films and books, commemorated with monuments and ceremonies attracting millions of visitors. The Falaise Gap, dramatic in its scale of destruction and clear in its strategic importance, received significant historical attention, but Mortain, falling between these more famous battles, became a footnote in popular histories, mentioned briefly, if at all, known primarily to military historians and veterans who had fought there. The battle did not fit the narrative of inevitable Allied victory because it demonstrated how vulnerable Allied forces had been to German counterattack. It did not provide clear heroes or villains, just soldiers on both sides fighting desperately for objectives that history would judge as either insignificant or catastrophic depending on outcome. The 30th Infantry Division, which bore the brunt of German attacks at Mortain, received surprisingly limited recognition for their stand, despite having fought one of the most important defensive battles of the war. The division's casualties, 2,400 killed, wounded, or missing during the battle, testified to intensity of combat they had endured. The 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry, received Presidential Unit Citation for their defence of Hill 314. High honour, but one that came with little public recognition. Individual soldiers received medals, silver stars for valour, bronze stars for service, purple hearts for wounds. But the battle itself faded from public consciousness, overshadowed by larger dramas at Normandy beaches and Falaise Pocket. Veterans returning home found that civilians who asked about their war service had heard of D-Day and the Battle of the Bulge, but not of Mortain. Explaining what had happened required describing a battle no one had heard of, fought over terrain no one recognised, for stakes that were not immediately obvious. many veterans simply stopped trying to explain. The town of Mortain itself, reconstructed slowly over the 5 years following the battle, rebuilt largely with American Marshall Plan assistance that helped all of France recover from war devastation. The medieval church was restored, though careful observers could still see bullet impacts in stone walls. Buildings destroyed in the battle were replaced with modern construction that stood out against remaining medieval structures. By 1950, Mortain looked superficially normal, a small French market town where nothing much happened. But residents who had lived through the battle carried memories that reconstruction could not erase. Every street corner held a story, every building had been a fighting position. The streams where children played were the same streams where soldiers had sought cover from machine gun fire. Older residents could walk through town and recall exactly what had happened at each location, where American soldiers had died, where German tanks had burned, where civilians had hidden in cellars listening to battle above them. The question of whether Hill 314's defense had been worth the casualties remained debated among military historians decades after the battle. Tactically, the hill had provided invaluable observation that allowed American artillery to destroy German vehicles throughout the sector. Strategically, the hill had tied down German forces that might have been more usefully employed elsewhere. Psychologically, the defense had demonstrated American determination and German inability to achieve objectives, even when they achieved tactical surprise. But 300 casualties in 6 days to hold a single hill, was that price justified? Could the same strategic effect have been achieved at lower cost? The questions were easier to ask from perspective of years than from perspective of Major Herlong on August 6, making decisions in real time with incomplete information. Military historians could conduct analysis with perfect hindsight. Herlong had to command with fog of war, uncertainty, and immediate pressure. The debate continued in academic journals and military staff colleges, theoretical discussions of decisions that had been matters of life and death. The annual commemorations at Mortain diminished over decades as veterans aged and died, as World War II receded from living memory into history. The 50th anniversary in 1994 brought significant attendance, veterans in their 70s returning one last time, some with children and grandchildren to show them where history had happened. The 60th anniversary in 2004 was smaller, fewer veterans surviving, average age approaching 80. By the 70th anniversary in 2014, the commemoration was attended primarily by historians, local officials, and family members, representing veterans who could no longer travel. The direct connection to the battle, the living testimony of men who had been there, was fading. Soon the battle would exist only in archives and memoirs, photographs and official reports, preserved, but no longer alive in memory of participants. The broader lessons of Mortain about strategic delusion, about material reality overcoming tactical skill, about consequences of serving leadership disconnected from truth, remained relevant decades after the battle. Military academies studied Mortain as example of how not to conduct operations, how Hitler's refusal to accept reality guaranteed disaster, how operational excellence at division level could not overcome strategic incompetence at army group level. The battle illustrated dangers of commanders who valued loyalty over honesty, who shot messengers bearing bad news, who demanded miracles and executed those who could not deliver them. Von Kluge's suicide stood as warning about what happened when professional soldiers served political leaders who would not tolerate truth. The lesson was not unique to Nazi Germany or World War II. Any system that punished honesty and rewarded optimistic lies would eventually produce Mortain's battles, fought for impossible objectives, casualties suffered for unattainable goals, disasters that everyone could see coming except those in command. The veterans who gathered at Hill 314 for final commemorations in the 21st century understood something that histories and analyses could never fully capture. They had held that ground not because it was important in abstract strategic sense, but because they had been ordered to hold it and because they refused to abandon comrades who depended on them. The strategic significance, the historical importance, the lessons for future wars, none of that had mattered in August 1944. What had mattered was the man in the next foxhole, the responsibility to unit and mission, the simple determination not to fail. Whether historians judged the sacrifice worthwhile or wasteful was irrelevant to men who had made the sacrifice. They had done their duty as they understood it, had survived or died trying, had earned the right to be remembered. The monument on Hill 314, with its simple inscription, "They held," said everything that needed saying. They had been given an impossible mission and they had accomplished it. The battle might be forgotten by history, overshadowed by larger dramas. But the men who fought there would never forget, and as long as one veteran remained alive, Mortain would be remembered not as forgotten battle but as testament to what soldiers could endure when duty demanded everything.